their work in this House. As private individuals, we are equal under the law with those whom we represent. Parliament should be open to those whom it represents. We should seek to explain its work to those who elect us and make them welcome here. The security of this building and those who work and visit here depends upon all of us. We have a duty to be vigilant and to assist those whose job it is to maintain this place as a safe place to work. Before moving to the first business of the new Parliament, I would like to express my very best wishes for the new session to all honourable members and to all those who work here. Order.
Spill.
I have to acquaint the House that this House has this day attended Her Majesty in the House of Peers, and that Her Majesty was pleased to make a most gracious speech from the throne to both Houses of Parliament, of which I have, for greater accuracy, obtained a copy. I shall direct that the terms of the speech be printed in the votes and proceedings. Copies are already available in the vote office. Before I call the mover and seconder, I want to announce the proposed subjects of debate during the remaining days on the Loyal Address, which are tomorrow, Britain's place in the world; Wednesday, public services; Thursday, the climate emergency; Monday, the NHS; Tuesday, the economy. I shall first call Lee Rowley to move, and then Sarah Newton to second the address. Lee Rowley.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that a humble address be presented to Her Majesty as follows. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, in Parliament assembled, beg leave to offer our humble thanks to Your Majesty for the gracious speech which Your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament. It is a great honour to propose the Loyal Address, both for myself and for the constituency of North East Derbyshire, my home, which I am so proud and privileged to represent. I stand here this afternoon, however, firstly, to right a historic and terrible injustice, that no member from my great county of Derbyshire has moved the Loyal Address for over 100 years. The delay has been long, Mr. Speaker. It was last moved in 1903, when Colonel Gretton, representing the constituency so ably now served by my honourable friend from South Derbyshire, last moved the address. I took to reading that speech just before today to get some inspiration for the rather terrifying job that I now have. I'm afraid to report it only increased my sense of nervousness about the task ahead. I discover that before the good Colonel even uttered a single syllable, Hansard notes, with that courteous understatement which Hansard is famous for, that he was heard with much difficulty. Whatever that is an Edwardian euphemism for, I think is lost to time. But I will seek to avoid the challenge of my county forebearer by speaking both loudly and, at least at the start, avoiding Brexit. Secondly, another worry arose, if not for me, then for the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition. The subject which Colonel Gretton turned to first in his speech was not education or health or welfare or taxes, nor even his constituency. It is a subject which continues to be returned to time and time again in this place: Venezuela. The the Colonel was keen to exclaim that the recent policy successes in South America had been achieved without the destruction of personal property. I wonder whether our Venezuelan friends will have the same preeminence in 2019 that they did in 1903. And finally, I was struck by the response of the Prime Minister, Mr. Balfour, that his initial remarks were not focused on great matters of state, but instead to ensure that he did not impede upon the impending dinner hour of the members who were present. I hope not to repeat that today by applying some Derbyshire common sense and knowing when to sit down. I am relatively new to this place and have only been here since the 2017 general election. And having just turned 39, I think I tend, hopefully, just towards the more youthful end of the scale of the parliamentary age range. Not least, if he will forgive me, when comparing myself with my parliamentary neighbour from Bolsover, who was in customary fine form this morning and who has been undertaking and providing quips to this House since a decade before I was born. So, having only witnessed having witnessed only one Queen's speech here today, I searched for advice about how to do it this afternoon and discovered that the best definition was laid out by my right honourable friend from Sutton Coldfield in a speech in the 1990s. My joy quickly turned to horror when, having read his remarks, I found I had been given a privilege by the Treasury bench, which is, and I quote, usually accorded to some genial old codger on the way out. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that Brexit has aged us all in the last 3 years, but I didn't realise that my right honourable friends in government thought it had affected my youth so badly, nor how keen they were to apparently get rid of me. We meet today in troubled times, at the end of the longest parliamentary session since the Civil War. It is a time which more experienced members of this House tell us newer recruits is just not normal. Our precious body politic lies bloodied, poisoned by rancour and enmity, and until the hope of the last few days, paralysed by competing legitimacies. Our politics is fought over, sometimes viciously, and by those of us here in a way that I have never known in my lifetime. And I say that as a working class kid who grew up in the north during the miners' strike, who is the nephew of somebody who worked from the NUM and whose grandparents toiled under the villages that I now have the privilege to represent. So I have some knowledge of challenge and tumult. We are in a hard place, and all of us, whatever bench or chair we sit in, are responsible for where we end up. In the last few days, there is at least hope that this toxic and crippling fog which we have created might just be lifting, as the Prime Minister sketches an outline of a way forward. And I speak as someone who has been robust in my review of previous proposals. But the House must surely see, as I do, we have debated long enough. This is a moment for decision, and we were elected to make decisions. If there is light at the end of the tunnel later this week, and heaven knows I hope there will be, we have a fundamental responsibility in this place to try and resolve this most vexed of problems and allow our despairing and embittered country to move on. For the health of our democracy and to restore faith in this most venerable of institutions, in my view, we simply must get Brexit done. And I hope deep down that this place realises that it is time to get back to the other priorities of our country. And if it doesn't, this shattered Parliament will be given even shorter shrift than the residents of North East Derbyshire have already given it. They speak plainly and honestly in my 41 towns, villages and hamlets. They are good, honest, industrious men and women who are the quiet backbone of our great country. In Johnfield and Killamarsh, they seek only to get up every morning and get a fair crack of the whip and be able to get on. In Eckington and Clay Cross, they seek betterment in life for their families and their children, recognising that communities are built from the ground up, not imposed top down, and understanding that governments should do some things well, not lots of things badly. They want governments who prioritise technological advancement and innovation in healthcare to allow people to get better quickly and to live longer. They want people who stand shoulder to shoulder with our brave officers on the front line through a police covenant. And they want governments who make it their mission to deliver fast broadband to all of our nations. That is why there is so much to be welcomed in this Queen's speech and why we must move beyond Brexit. My constituency sits towering around the presence of a church which has been there since the 12th century and can be seen from miles around. It is famous for a spire which twists and bends unconventionally into the sky. I am the son of that crooked spire, and so very proud to represent some of its domain today. And the values of those sons and daughters of North Derbyshire are the same values as other proud, working-class Northern and Midlands towns all across the country. And they're the values which propelled me here today. Hard work, aspiration, a hand up, not a hand out, freedom, liberty, society, real opportunity for ourselves and for our communities, and a desire to be set free to allow our talents to achieve what we can and not be told how to live our lives. Last Friday, I returned to my old school, St Mary's in Chesterfield, to talk about the importance of democracy. It reminded me of the first time I came here, 21 years ago, on a sixth form trip, when we were welcomed by our Member of Parliament at the time, the much respected Tony Benn. I come from a very different political tradition to Mr Benn, but he is still held in high esteem in my constituency. In the same year, he kindly showed me and my fellow students around this benches. He stood somewhere on here and asked 5 questions of politicians, as he did regularly. They are as pertinent today as they were then. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interests do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? I hope we remember that in the days ahead. And so, Mr Speaker, as we turn the page on one of the most tumultuous parliamentary sessions of our lives and dare to hope of new beginnings in a new one, I close by turning back to the Prime Minister, Mr Balfour, who responded to the last Derbyshire MP to propose a loyal address. Mr Balfour was a remarkable man who contributed much to our civic and political life in this country, and he was reputed once to have said, "Nothing matters very much, and few things matter at all." That may or may not be true, but in this most tempestuous of times, I think that most of us in this place recognise that the coming days do matter, that our nation is watching, anxious with hope and belief to move on. North East Derbyshire wants to move on and return to the priorities of the people so ably outlined in this programme of government. I think the country does too.
Thank you. Order. To second the address, I call Sarah Newton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's an absolute pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the member for North East Derbyshire, who has made an outstanding speech and has demonstrated yet again what a champion he is for his constituents. Now, Mr Speaker, when I was asked to second the humble address, I felt honoured, but I also felt some consternation. Of course, it's always an honour to represent my constituents in this place. While the House may very much tire of me talking about Cornwall, I will never tire of speaking up for the Duchy and its great people. Now, I imagine there are many people watching this debate at home, and I think they might prefer to be casting their eyes over that dark-haired and handsome Member of Parliament for the 18th century. Now, of course, I'm referring to Ross Poldark, my fictional predecessor who represented Truro. Now, I have to confess that even when I was in the Whip's office, I wasn't any use with a scythe. As my ancestors were Cornish tin miners, I think of myself more as a Demenza than as a Ross. So we can all occasionally indulge in a bit of wishful thinking. Now, I felt a degree of consternation because I was asked to give the speech which, well, probably along with my honourable friend, I felt it was reserved for those people that Whips had found to reach the high watermark of their career in this place. So I don't know about you, Mr Speaker, but I still very much feel like I'm 35 and I think the best years are ahead of me. Now, it's nearly 10 years since I first spoke in this chamber, describing beautiful Cornwall and highlighting my creative, inventive, enterprising and determined constituents. Those qualities are as evident today as they were then. And thanks to the steps taken by government since 2010 and working with the many can-do people in my constituency, we're making real progress in improving the quality of people's lives. And the bills announced today, along with the recently announced increased investment in our public services, will be able to move further and faster in ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to reach their potential. From improving educational opportunities and access to high-quality health and care services, to better paid and high-quality jobs. And the increase in the number of detectives painstakingly researching and gathering evidence to solve crime in our streets is most welcome. The funding attached is enough for 20,000 officers or one Colleen Rooney. But most importantly of all, leaving our natural environment in better condition than we found it. Our excellent local enterprise partnership has rightly identified Cornwall's abundance of natural resources, which, when harnessed, will make a massive contribution to the government's clean growth strategy. In my maiden speech, I singled out the potential for deep geothermal energy as a significant renewable energy technology. And I'm delighted to report to the House today that we now have the hottest, deepest hole in the UK. And the trials to generate electricity are well underway. Now, it's been a long journey, and the determination of all involved in this project clearly illustrates the UK's global leadership on tackling climate change. We're now working on floating wind in the Celtic Sea, which has even greater potential. Mr. Speaker, the UK has decarbonised faster than any major economy, reducing our emissions by 38% since 1990. We know we need to go further and faster, which is I'm very proud that it was a Conservative government that supported the world-leading net zero target, and today is setting out measures that will enable us to do this. The landmark Environment Bill is a huge step in ensuring we leave the natural environment in a better state than we found it. The bill will enable a comprehensive framework for legally binding targets, including a target for air quality and the establishment of a new Office for Environmental Protection. Now, climate change, together with the threat to our natural environment, is the most serious challenge we face today, and our response must be comprehensive, with action taken across the whole economy. But I'm confident we can do this. Why? Because there is now widespread concern and support for action, because we have what it takes to rise to this challenge. It's a real opportunity to grow our economy more sustainably, but also there's an opportunity to grow our economy more successfully. Like members across this House, every week I have meetings with a wide range of people who are fully invested in wanting us to succeed in meeting our net zero target. Now, if we're to harness this enthusiasm and expertise, it can't just be about distant international summits with acronyms that few people understand. When the UK hosts the International UN Climate Summit in Glasgow next year, it must ensure that every sector of society is involved in the conversation. With an issue as big as climate change, we need everyone's collective brainpower to find the right solutions, and we must have everyone on board if we're to implement them. Post-Brexit, the country needs to unite around a shared national purpose, and I believe this is it. By enabling comprehensive action on climate change across the whole of society, with everyone involved and no one left behind, we can start rebuilding a truly united kingdom, one we can all be proud of. But that's the thing, Mr. Speaker. We have to have that unity of purpose. We now have to agree on the one thing that we haven't been able to agree upon, the one thing that's holding the nation back, and that is our future relationship with Europe. It's been tough going, and we've debated this thoroughly for years. But it's this week above all others, when we must redouble our efforts, compromise, and find a consensus on our way forward. So, Mr. Speaker, I've been thinking about what we could do in this place to create the right atmosphere, the right mood, one that will promote trust, generate harmony, and result in a consensus and that unity of purpose. So I was thinking, what do we do when we're under pressure, when we're anxious, when success seems so far away? What do we do in our personal lives, with our families, in good times and bad, in our communities when we get together, whether in collective acts of worship or when our beloved football or rugby teams are playing? What we all do on these occasions is we sing.
Yes. Yes.
We sing because it makes us all feel good.
Yes.
Now, Gareth Malone has inspired the nation's workplaces, and he's proven that singing together increases feelings of trust and common purpose between people. So I thought, Mr. Speaker, what songs could we sing? On our way this week.
Wheels on the bus.
I thought perhaps we should begin with Queen's Under Pressure, which could be an apt as with the ticking timescale of the Brexit deadline approaches at the end of October. Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow by Fleetwood Mac could focus our minds both on our future relationship with Europe and the need to respond to the threats of climate change. To encourage greater cooperation between all members in this House, we could be singing We're All in This Together from High School Musical, or Meet Me Halfway by Black Eyed Peas. I hope we could work our way through this songbook. We would eventually unite in a rousing rendition of Johnny Cash's I Can See Clearly Now, leading us ultimately, I hope, to Gloria Gaynor's Let's Make a Deal. Now, returning to our own shores, the Beatles can point us in the right direction with their song We Can Work It Out. After all, Mr. Speaker, that's what the nation expects us to do.
Thank you. The question is that an humble address be presented to Her Majesty as follows. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland in Parliament assembled, beg leave to offer our humble thanks to Your Majesty for the gracious speech which Your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament. The Leader of the Opposition.
Go on, Jeremy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Go on, Jeremy.
This year marks two anniversaries. The 70th anniversary of the 1949 Parliament Act, which asserted the primacy of this House over the then hereditary House of Lords. And I think in our deliberations this week, it's worth remembering the primacy of the House of Commons over that and over the executive. It's also the 50th anniversary of the 1969 Representation of the People Act, which I remember very well because it extended the vote to everyone over the age of 18. As we meet today, I think, Mr. Speaker, we should commit to strengthening our democracy and the vital role of this democratic House in holding the executive to account. By tradition, at the beginning of each parliamentary session, we commemorate the members of the House we've lost in the last year. Earlier this year, we lost our great friend Paul Flynn, a fiercely independent, passionate, very kind and very principled member of this House. I remember him reading out in this House the names of those who had died in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, two wars which he opposed. He briefly served in our shadow cabinet, and I think the whole House was enlivened by his performance. He joked at the first meeting, both the shadow cabinet and when he spoke from the floor, that there was a part of a job creation, that he was part of a job creation scheme for octogenarians. He wasn't there because he was an excellent orator, campaigner and member of the House as well. He was there because he was an excellent representative of the people of Newport West, the constituency he served so well and so passionately for 32 years. Mr. Speaker, today's proposer and seconder of the Loyal Address share a route to this place. Both were local councillors prior to entering the House. And I pay tribute to all those who put themselves forward to represent local communities as councillors, because without them our democracy would be worse off. They work hard, long hours, and often not particularly well rewarded or appreciated for the work that they do. And I think we should recognise they are part of our democracy. I was a little surprised to see that the member for North East Derbyshire had been asked by the Prime Minister to propose the motion today, because I understand they've not always enjoyed the best of relationships. As we know, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has earned a reputation for enjoying life to the fullest. During his time as London Mayor, I understand he became incandescent with anger and rage on learning that the honourable member, at that time a Westminster councillor, intended introducing a nightlife tax. Thankfully, the member was able to reassure the now Prime Minister that the nightlife tax only applied to car parking charges and not to other activities. Although on reflection, he may have missed a great opportunity of earning a great deal of revenue for the people of Westminster. I suspect it's no coincidence that the member for North East Derbyshire has shown great independence of thought as a politician, as he grew up in Chesterfield during the 1980s, a cradle of political dissent. Today, the member is again in danger of finding himself upbraided by the Prime Minister, this time as a member of the nose-ringed, uncooperative Crusties. Indeed, he took his arguments against fracking into the lion's den of the 2018 Tory party conference and predicted that his party's support for fracking would see them lose seats in North East Derbyshire, I assume. My late great friend Tony Benn, the honourable member for Chesterfield, in one of his last books, The Last Diary, said, title was Dare to be a Daniel. I hope the honourable member continues to dare, and I hope he will also emulate the daredom, the experience and the wit of his neighbour, my great friend, the member for Bolsover. Yay. Researching today's seconder, he is my great friend. Researching today's seconder, Mr. Speaker, the member for Truro and Falmouth, I believed I've uncovered yet another secret Conservative project originating in Merton in the 1980s that led directly to Downing Street 3 decades later. Chief of the Wimbledon set, as they became known, was the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead. By her side stood her loyal lieutenants, the Honourable Members for Wimbledon, for Basingstoke, and of course Truro and Falmouth. Today, those are part of the Wimbledon set who are described as competent and professional, which really begs the question, how did the Right Honourable Member for Epsom and Ewell ever sneak into the Wimbledon set? Mr. Speaker, the House may not know this. Most expensive Transport Secretary we've ever had, don't worry about it. Mr. Speaker, the House may not know this, but in 2013, the Honourable Member and I found ourselves in political agreement. I was happy to support her early day motion to mark the anniversary of the death of Emily Wilding Davidson. I think it's worth the House hearing some of EDM 164. The House commemorates the centenary of the death of Emily Davidson, salutes her courage on behalf of the suffragette cause, and pays tribute to her and her fellow campaigners for their brave and ultimately successful efforts to secure votes for women. Mr. Speaker, while I may be dubious of the company she speaks, the Honourable Member is more deserving of the honour of seconding today's loyal address. Mr. Speaker, there has never been such a farce as a government with a majority of -45 and a a 100% record of defeat in the House of Commons, setting out a legislative agenda they know cannot be delivered in this Parliament. And, honourable members, heckles about a general election. I said to the Prime Minister last month, get an extension, take us away from the dangers of a no deal, and then we're in a position to do that. So, Mr. Speaker, we may only be just weeks away from the first Queen's speech of a Labour government. And in that Queen's speech, Labour will put forward the most radical and people-focused programme in modern times. A once-in-a-generation chance to rebuild and transform our country. It will let the people decide on Brexit, build an economy that works for all, rebuild our public services that support everyone, tackle the climate emergency, and reset our global role to one based on peace and human rights.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. The Prime Minister gave the Right Honourable Gentleman the opportunity of having a general election tomorrow. Had that general election taken place tomorrow, if he'd have been successful, he would have been going to the Council of Ministers this weekend to negotiate. Why did he reject that opportunity when he's been calling for it all the time?
Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, because we don't trust the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government has had 3.5 years to get Brexit done, and they've failed. The only legitimate way to sort Brexit now is to let the people decide with a final say. To pass this House, any deal needs to meet the needs of workers and businesses. That means including a new customs union, a close single market relationship, and guarantees of workers' rights, consumer standards, and environmental protection. And if I may say so, guarantees that the Good Friday Agreement will not be damaged or undermined in any way. A withdrawal agreement was announced, but we don't know yet if the government has done a deal. What we are sure of is that this House has legislated against crashing out with no deal, and that the Prime Minister must comply with the law if a deal does not pass this House. The Queen's speech talked about the opportunities that arise from Brexit, but the government's own figures suggest a free trade agreement approach will cause a near 7% hit to our economy, while a no-deal crash-out would cause a 10% hit. These seem like the opportunities that we could all live without. For many people, Mr. Speaker, the economy of this country is fundamentally weak. Since 2010, there are more workers in poverty, more children in poverty, more pensioners in poverty. There are more families without a home to call their own, and more people, fellow citizens, sleeping rough on our streets. Fewer people can afford their own home, and wages are still lower than they were a decade ago. Productivity is falling, and the economy contracted last month. At the weekend, Mr. Speaker, I was in Hastings on the south coast, where last year food banks, staffed by volunteers, distributed 87,453 meals. And 1 in 7 people in that town live in fuel poverty. Are those not shocking figures in this country in the 21st century? There was nothing in the Queen's speech to address our stagnant economy, nothing to address low pay and insecure work, nothing to reverse the rising levels of child poverty or of pensioner poverty. So,
Go on, Seymour. Go on, Seymour.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree with me as well that the challenges now faced by rising child poverty, compounded by mental health issues that young people face, compounded by the rising special educational needs not being met by the resources that our education system needs, are contributing to a next generation growing up in despair, which the country will pay the price of for generations to come?
I thank my friend for that intervention. We have almost a lost generation. Children going to school, understaffed schools, very few teaching assistants, head teachers going out with a begging bowl to parents to try to match the school budget, and too many young people growing up in incredible levels of stress, of bad housing, and of stress and worry about the future. That contributes to the mental health crisis that this country as a whole must address. So, will the Prime Minister match Labour's commitments to scrap the benefit freeze, end the benefit cap, ditch the bedroom tax, scrap the two-child limit and the disgusting rape clause, and end punitive sanctions in the benefit system? Whilst, Mr. Speaker, we welcome the legislation to ensure employers pass on tips to their workers, something the Labour and trade union movement has long campaigned for, the government must go further, and I would urge them to listen to the package of measures set out by my honourable friend, the member for North West Durham, when she made a brilliant speech at the TUC last month. This speech, Mr. Speaker, this Queen's speech today was supposed to herald an end to austerity and a new vision. Instead, it barely begins to unpick the devastating cuts to public services. The National Health Service, yes, it will give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. Would he agree that the climate and nature emergencies demand so much more than just the 6 words they were recorded in the speech, and an environment bill that will widely weaken the protections we currently enjoy as members of the EU? And would he join me in calling for a comprehensive Green New Deal to decarbonise the economy by 2030 so we can show we're genuinely serious about the climate crisis?
I thank the member for that intervention. I am coming on to that in a moment, but I absolutely agree with her. What we need is a Green New Deal. We need a green industrial revolution, and we have to face up to the reality of the climate emergency. If we don't, the damage to the next generation and the one after that will be even worse. Our National Health Service has suffered the longest funding squeeze in its history, and life expectancy is falling and infant mortality is rising. Schools have had their budgets cut, class sizes have risen, and head teachers are sending begging letters to parents. Any member opposite who's concerned about that should simply take a walk down the road and speak to any primary school head teacher about the stress they're going through and the stress their pupils are going through. The police have lost over 20,000 officers whilst violent crime soars.
The gentleman for giving way. Would he therefore support this government's policy to rapidly increase school funding?
Well, if only they were, it would be a good thing.
They chopped it for 10 years.
All the off-the-cuff announcements by the Prime Minister since July do not add up to the austerity created by that party and by the Liberal Democrats during their period in coalition. Mr. Speaker, NHS England has made clear that core treatment targets cannot be met within the funding settlement offered by the government. They cannot be trusted with the National Health Service. Waiting lists are going up, waiting times are going up, and the shortage of GPs continues to create problems at every doctor's surgery. The government's refusals to guarantee key standards lets down the 4.4 million patients on the waiting list, all those waiting longer and longer in excellent emergency departments, and nearly 34,000 patients who waited over 62 days for cancer treatment last year.
Shameful.
With 40,000 nurse vacancies, there is an urgent need to restore the nurse bursary so we have the nurses of tomorrow. But if the Prime Minister really wants to defend it, Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister really wants to defend the NHS, he needs to end privatisation so that our NHS is focused on making people better, not people on the make. A universal service free at the point of use. We don't just want tinkering around the edges. We want to bin the Health and Social Care Act and truly end all privatisation within our National Health Service.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He talks about the bursary system. I trained on the bursary system and lived on a pittance each month. It's this government that's introducing degree nurse apprenticeships when the student nurses...
Well, I've got news for her. It's her government that ended the nurse bursary system. Simple. So, will the Prime Minister support Labour's plans to provide free prescriptions to people in England, as has been done in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland? And will he back Labour's commitment to legislate for safe staffing levels in all our hospitals? In the last Queen's speech in 2017, it stated, and I quote, "My government will reform mental health legislation and ensure that mental health is prioritised in the National Health Service in England." 2 years on, all we have are the same warm words. The mental health crisis continues to get worse and worse as many people in great stress are told there is no therapy available to them for several months, and as a result, terrible things can happen. It's a similar story, Mr. Speaker, on social care. The 2017 Queen's speech promised, and I quote, "My ministers will work to improve social care and will bring forward proposals." Today, we have the same promise after 2 years of inaction and failure, with 87 people dying every day while they wait for social care that is not provided. This Queen's speech is shockingly weak on education, with no commitment on early years, on colleges or on universities. The money announced for our schools does not restore the funding lost since 2010. It's all very well, Mr. Speaker, promising extra police, but the reason we don't have enough police is because the government cut 21,000 police jobs and nearly 7,000 police community support officers. And if the party opposite, the party in government, wants to talk about providing police with protections, perhaps they can tell the police why they subjected them and millions of other public sector workers to cuts in their pay, their pensions and damaging their terms and conditions of employment. I know this government doesn't have a great record of listening to judges, but surely they are aware that judges already have the powers to ensure that the most serious offenders serve more than half of their sentences in jail. Our prisons are severely overcrowded. There are 2,500 fewer prison officers in our prisons today than in 2010. Hence, many of the problems throughout our prison service. The privatisation of the probation service was a shambolic and costly failure. And I hope that lessons have been learned and we'll examine closely any proposals on rehabilitating offenders. Because I hope that alongside the tougher sentencing, the government will also recognise that too many people are in prison on very short sentences for non-violent and non-sexual offences. Our society, I believe, could be better served by them being subject to community sentencing and restorative justice. And what will the Prime Minister do to address the appalling low conviction rate for rape and other serious sexual offences? The dog whistle rhetoric around foreign offenders, Mr. Speaker, is a rather ugly mask for the fact that by crashing out of the EU, this government risks losing some of the most effective measures in tackling cross-border crime. The European arrest warrant, participation in Eurojust, and access to numerous databases. We will, of course, study the detail closely of the government's proposals on rail reform. But it's no good simply changing the way in which train operating companies carry on extracting profit from our fragmented railway system. Only a Labour government will cap fares and ensure the railway is run for the passengers, not for profit. And there's nothing in this Queen's speech to reverse the devastating cuts to bus services all over the country. It's a Labour government that will restore rail and bus services and the integration of those services. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago, the horror of Grenfell happened. We all remember it very well, and we remember the response of the public and in this House. But I have to say, 9 out of 10 private blocks of flats with Grenfell-style cladding still have not had it replaced. Not a single private block has been made safe under this Prime Minister. So will he confirm today that he will set a hard deadline for all landlords to replace dangerous cladding? That he will toughen sanctions against block owners that won't do that work, and will fund the retrofitting of sprinklers in all high-rise social housing blocks, and restore the budget cuts to our fire service, who acted so heroically on that dreadful night of the Grenfell fire. And perhaps he can set out what measures there are to address this government's abject failure on housing that's led to more people sleeping on our streets, more families in hostels and in temporary accommodation, and fewer people able to buy their own home. Labour will end no-fault evictions. We will tackle the leasehold scandal and kickstart the largest council house building programme for a generation. It will be Labour that will fix the housing crisis in this country. The introduction of pension dashboards is welcome, as is the legislation for CDC pension schemes, which I hope will help resolve the Royal Mail dispute. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, these proposals do nothing to address the injustice done to women born in the 1950s. That injustice must be put right. And this Queen's speech additionally does nothing to guarantee the free TV licence for the over 75s. This government, Mr. Speaker, handed our armed forces a pay cut for 7 years, and cuts to council budgets in England have made it far harder to deliver the Armed Forces Covenant, leaving our veterans, our personnel and all of their families worse off. We will not allow this government to stifle democracy by making it harder for people to vote. There was only one instance of voter personation in the last election. 11 million people in this country don't have... It's serious. It's about elections and it's about democracy. 11 million people in this country don't have a passport or a driving licence. There are huge risks in the legislation being proposed, which will disproportionately affect working class, ethnic minority and young voters.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way on that point.
does he agree with me that this decision to require voters to have photo ID at the ballot box is clearly an attempt by the party opposite to suppress voting? Particularly, Mr. Speaker, designed deliberately to hit the poorest hardest.
There is no question, Mr. Speaker, and my friend is absolutely right. This legislation is designed to hit the poorest the hardest, those that don't have passport, don't have access to other identity, and will thus lose their right to vote and decide who governs in the future. Freedom.
Order. The right honourable gentleman will give way when he chooses. He doesn't need to be told what to do by people gesticulating at him. Stop it. It's low grade, down market and out of keeping with the code. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, freedom of movement has given opportunities to millions of British people to live, to work and to retire across Europe. And it has benefited our economy absolutely immensely, with European Union workers playing a key role in sustaining many of our industries and our public service. No responsible member would vote to rip that up unless there is a proper plan in place. In the shadow of the Windrush scandal, the settled status scheme for European Union citizens risks another round of wrongful denial of rights and shameful deportations. I look forward to the Prime Minister assuring those European Union citizens that have made such an enormous contribution to our lives and our society that they will have a secure future in this country. The government says that it will be at the forefront of solving the most complex international security issues and global challenges. And yet they're playing precisely no role in stopping the horrors unfolding in the Kurdish areas of northern Syria, ending the war and humanitarian crisis in Yemen, or standing up for the rights of the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, or the people of Palestine, Ecuador, or Hong Kong. They're continuing to cozy up to Donald Trump and sitting idly by as he wrecks the world's efforts to tackle climate change and nuclear proliferation. As the member for Brighton said on an intervention, the crisis of our age, Mr. Speaker, is the climate emergency, as declared by this House in May. But there is no action announced in this Queen's speech. So, Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to the climate school strikers and to Extinction Rebellion. Sadly, the government hasn't listened. The Prime Minister derided them as nose-ringed crusties, although I note their number included a Conservative former member of the European Parliament, who I believe is related to the Prime Minister. So many people are concerned, Mr. Speaker, about bad air quality, the failure to invest in renewable energy, and the pollution of our rivers and seas, and the loss of biodiversity. But only this government has the power and resource to tackle the climate emergency if it wanted to. But is missing with inaction. It's Labour that will bring forward a Green New Deal to tackle the climate emergency. The legislative programme, Mr. Speaker, is a propaganda exercise that the government cannot disguise. This government has failed on Brexit for over 3 years. They're barely beginning to undo the damage of a decade of cuts to our public services. It does nothing for people struggling to make ends meet, does nothing to make our world a safer place or tackle the climate emergency. The Prime Minister promised that this Queen's speech would dazzle us. On closer inspection, Mr. Speaker, it is nothing more than fool's gold.
Prime Minister!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government exists to serve the British people, and this Queen's speech delivers on their priorities. And by strengthening our NHS with the biggest programme of hospital building for a generation, by putting 20,000 more police on the streets, by unlocking the potential of the whole country with new infrastructure, better education and high technology, from gigabit broadband to a new national space strategy, we aim to create a new age of opportunity for the whole country. And as we prepare to get Brexit done by October the 31st, we are setting out now our vision of an open, global, free-trading United Kingdom, a high-wage, low-tax economy with the highest environmental standards, new protections for animal welfare, the best place to invest, the best place to start a business, the best place to start a family and send your kids to school, and without being chauvinistic or disrespectful to anywhere else in the world. In important respects, this country is the greatest place to live and to be. The greatest place on earth. Mr. Speaker, Her Majesty's gracious speech was proposed superbly by my honourable friend, the member for North East Derbyshire, the first Conservative to represent his seat since 1935, when presumably the honourable member opposite departed for Bolsover. And if honourable members are wondering whence my honourable friend derives his passion and his oratorical gifts, it may interest them to know that his aunt was secretary to Arthur Scargill. And I doubt that he shares many of the convictions of the former miners' leader, except one, that we should obey the democratic will of the people and get Brexit done by October the 31st. My honourable friend is also a passionate collector of airline memorabilia. His home is allegedly stocked a museum of airline wash bags, airline socks, and a vast fleet of model planes, including a model Extinction Rebellion protester glued to the roof. And all I can say to my honourable friend is cabin crew doors to automatic and cross-check, because his career is plainly about to take off, and his speech was in the very finest traditions of the House. Mr. Speaker, the Loyal Address was brilliantly seconded by my honourable friend, the member for Truro and Falmouth, who comes, if I can continue with the aeronautical metaphor, from a very different wing of the party. The modern Tory party is a vast and capacious low-carbon plane, by the way, and who has been highly successful as a campaigner for the rights of disabled people. And though she is known for her calm manner and her dulcet tones, when it comes to defending the interests of her native Cornwall or protecting the pasty against the fiscal depredations of former chancellors, she can be as fearsome as any Falmouth seagull going for your chips. And on the most divisive issue in modern Britain, which plagues us to this day, it is well known that she has come down on one side and will not be budged. It is jam first, not cream, on your scones. She is, Mr. Speaker, she is Cornish to her roots, and her speech also was in the best traditions of the House. Mr. Speaker, let me join the Right Honourable Gentleman in paying tribute to the much-loved and greatly missed Paul Flynn, who served his constituents in Newport West for 31 and a half years, a proud and witty Welshman who earned this obituary from Goldie Lookin' Chain, a South Wales rap ensemble straight out of Newport, is what they said. As an MP, he was well respected since 1987, when first elected. Across the parties, Paul was revered, and it's just possible he was born with that beard. Across the floor, far and wide, respected across the political divide, regardless of your own stance, left or right, raise a glass to Paul tonight. Mr. Speaker, I have no ideas as to the political preferences of the band members, Two Hats or Eggsy, but I think the whole House... I think the honourable lady may be right in what she interjects from a sedentary position, but I have no doubt that the whole House will agree with their tribute to Paul Flynn. Mr. Speaker, the speeches from my honourable friends from North East Derbyshire and Truro and Falmouth were in the finest traditions of the House, and the speech from the Leader of the Opposition was in the finest tradition of the tergiversating Leader of the Opposition. First he was opposed to no deal, now he seems to be opposed to any deal. First he was in favour of delivering Brexit, now he wants a second referendum. First he wanted an election, actually he wanted an election for quite a long time. Now he'd much rather not. He resembles a Janus, a push-me-pull-you facing both directions at once and yet unable to decide for either. His policy on cake is neither having it nor eating it. And frankly, I fear for his political health, because we can all see the Soviet era expulsions that are taking place in his circle, as one by one his lieutenants are purged, as Lenin purged the associates of poor old Trotsky. And there is Lenin, Mr. Speaker, the veteran fabricator of GLC budgets, as the Shadow Chancellor tightens his icy grip on the Labour Party. The contrast becomes ever starker. We're putting up wages, contrary to what he just said, we're putting up wages with the biggest expansion of the living wage ever seen. They would put up taxes, he would put up taxes. We will control immigration with a points-based system. He wants to, and of course, let me anticipate the point that my honourable friend is going to make, and we will look after the interests of the 3.4 million. They want to abandon immigration controls altogether, to judge by what he has just said. We back our armed services. He sides with their enemies historically. He sides with their enemies, and he has said he would like to disband them. We want to strengthen, and we will strengthen our United Kingdom. He would break it up, and I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. He was just saying there about how his government backs the armed services. He'll be aware that our army is almost 40,000 fewer than it was when the Conservatives came to power. He'll be aware that those people who are serving in our armed forces have seen their wages cut in real terms 7 years in a row. Tell us what he would do for a set of armed forces who he wasn't backing.
Mr. Speaker, I think that he should support a government, and I hope that he will support the government in the divisions, that is putting another £2.2 billion into our armed services, increasing spending on our armed services by 2.6%, and investing massively in shipbuilding and taking our armed services forward. And as he may know, there will be measures coming forward as a result of this Queen's speech which will do more to protect our armed services. And I give way with pleasure to my honourable friend.
To the Prime Minister for giving way. Defence is linked to foreign policy. Britain is respected around the world for the values it stands up for. One of them is freedom of religion or belief. It is not mentioned in the Queen's speech. Yesterday, parliamentarians from across the House, led by His Royal Highness Prince of Wales, were at the Holy See for the canonisation of Cardinal Newman. Can the Prime Minister confirm that religious freedom will always be a key priority for our government?
I thank my honourable friend for everything he does to promote religious freedom around the world, and I can certainly give him that assurance, and we will stand up for religious freedom in all our doings and in all our foreign policy. I will give way with pleasure to my honourable friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for allowing me to intervene on him. I know my right honourable friend really cares about legacy prosecutions and what's happening to soldiers like Dennis Hutchings, but there was no mention in the Queen's speech about looking after our veteran soldiers from Northern Ireland. And I know my right honourable friend intends to do that. So what are we going to do about it? Because it's urgent in the case of Dennis Hutchings.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and he in fact anticipates a point that I'm about to come to in my remarks. But let me deal with it out of order, and just as it were, Mr. Speaker, and say that we will be bringing forward legislation to protect serving and former serving personnel. And as he will know, the consultation on that matter has just come to an end. Mr. Speaker, I've drawn several important points of distinction between this government and the party led by the Leader of the Opposition. But for our present purposes, perhaps the most immediate is that he wants to dither and delay, whereas we want to get on and deliver Brexit on October the 31st. And I cannot in all conscience believe that is the right way forward for this country. And Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman recently said that he was daunted by the prospect that he might actually become Prime Minister. Well, I have to say that he is not alone in that fear. So is most of the opposition, to judge by their actions, most of the House of Commons, and indeed most of the country. And I can give him this reassurance, this consolation, that I intend to do everything I can to prevent that from happening. I hope very much that in spite of some of our differences, he will support at least some of the measures in the gracious speech. Because at the heart of this speech is an ambitious programme to unite our country with energy and with optimism, but also with the basic common sense of one nation conservatism. Contrary to some of the gloomier things that we heard just now, we have unemployment at the lowest level since 1974. We have inward investment at record highs. We have 700,000 fewer children in workless households than there were in 2010, and we are leading the world in so many sectors of the 21st century business and technology. And it is because of that economic success, that free market success, and I can see the Shadow Chancellor recoil at the notion of a free market success, like a Transylvanian in the sunlight. That is how we will look after those who look after us and keep us safe. That is how we will spend another £2.2 billion on the armed services, to get to the point the honourable gentleman raises. And yes, as I say, we will bring forward legislation to protect our serving men and women. Of course, I should be very clear. This government understands that no one can escape justice for a crime that they have committed. But we also understand that there should be no unfair prosecution when no new evidence has been produced. And yes, in the same spirit, we will protect our brave police who run towards danger to keep us safe by putting the police covenant into law and by giving them the political support that they need to do their job. And even if that means difficult and intrusive procedures like stop and search, because those procedures save lives. And as we back our police and insist on serious sentencing for serious crimes, and I think it was the Labour Party that instituted automatic early release, this government, this one nation government, also insists. Yes, I'll give way with pleasure. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the leader of the Conservative Party, our Prime Minister, on delivering an excellent Queen's speech, the one of many over the years, I trust. He said rightly to the Leader of the Opposition that there should be no further dithering and delay, and I agree entirely. As we exit the EU on the 31st of October, can he confirm, once and for all, that the immigration bill that his government will bring forward will absolutely and unequivocally enshrine in primary legislation the rights of my mother and father and 3 million other EU nationals?
Minister. Yes, and not only can I give him that absolute and unequivocal guarantee, Mr. Speaker, but I'm delighted to say that 2 million EU nationals in this country have already registered under the EU registration system. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
The Prime Minister for giving way. Could he give us an assurance that the legislation which he intends to introduce to protect those members of the armed forces, in keeping with his one nation philosophy, will include those who served in Northern Ireland, and he will not be detracted from that by the efforts of the Northern Ireland office, who would try to placate Sinn Féin rather than protect soldiers.
Hear, hear. I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I know that he campaigns passionately on this issue, and I merely repeat what I think he would agree with, which is that no one should escape justice for a crime that he or she may have committed. But it cannot be right that people should face unfair prosecutions when no new evidence has been forthcoming, and that applies across the whole of our country. And as I say, this is a one-nation government that insists not only on dealing with crime, but also with the causes of crime, as a former Labour leader once put it, by the way, and in tackling all the causes of mental ill health or alienation in young people. And that's why today we announce a new programme to purge online harms from the internet and to invest massively in youth clubs. And we vow, as One Nation Conservatives, never to abandon anyone, never to write off any young person because they have been in prison, but to help them into work, and by investing in prisons, as we are, to prevent them from becoming academies of crime. And when we tackle crime as One Nation Conservatives, when we tackle the problems of mental ill health, we are doing something for the social justice of the country, because we all know that it is the poorest and the neediest who are disproportionately the victims of crime. And we know that it is the poorest who are most likely to suffer from mental ill health. And so it's our job as a campaigning government to level up investment across the nation. And I'm proud now that we are seeing the biggest programme of investment in the NHS for a generation. In 10 years' time, as a result of decisions that are being taken now, there will be 40 new hospitals. We have fantastic NHS staff. We have fantastic NHS staff, the best in the world. And it's time to give them the funding and the facilities that they deserve. And I'm proud, by the way, members opposite have shouted out about education. I'm proud that we're levelling up with a £14 billion programme of investment in our schools, in our primary and secondary schools, and I hope that they will support that, because we believe that is the best way to create and to spread opportunity more fairly and more uniformly across the country, to give every child a superb education. I give way to President Mark.
Can I welcome the Queen's speech and its emphasis on the people's priorities? Is my right honourable friend aware that in my borough of Bexley, people want Brexit done, but then they want a one-nation Conservative government going forward with all the other policies that we've got in the Queen's speech for the benefit of all the people? We don't want to go back to the Labour of the 1970s, which was a failure.
Well, my right honourable friend is completely right, because what we have is a choice between a semi-Marxist opposition that would set this country back decades, if not Marxist, and a one-nation government that understands the vital importance of wealth creation. I give way with pleasure to the honourable lady.
I'm very grateful that the Prime Minister has given way to a woman MP.
Yes.
And will he clarify whether, in the Queen's speech, where there was very little information about the climate change emergency, whether he will give a little bit more detail on what the government will do in relation to this pressing issue which is affecting so many young people and their mental health?
I thank her very much for her question, and she's raising a very good point, because actually at the heart of the Queen's speech is provision for a new independent environmental regulator that will invigilate this government and any government in the future as we achieve our climate change targets. And that is how this country can hope to be carbon neutral, to be net zero by 2050. And that is what we are going to achieve. And that is our programme. I'll give way happily
to the Prime Minister for giving way. He said rightly a moment ago that those who are poorest are hardest hit by crime. Can he explain, therefore, why having lost 1,120 police officers, the Merseyside force has been told by the Home Office that it's only allowed to recruit 200 more?
Well, I mean, the honourable lady raises a reasonable question, but the answer is that this is the first wave, and there are 7,000. There are 7,000 being recruited this year, or 7,000 or 8,000 being recruited this year, and the volume of applications is, I'm delighted to say, very high. And I believe that our approach is right. I'd like to give way.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and just to pick up the point on the environment, because the Leader of the Opposition seemed to suggest that there was not much about the environment in this speech. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the UK is leading the world on the environment, leading the world on helping developing countries fight back against climate change, and that in this Queen's speech, which I have in my hand, there are new measures on water quality, on air quality, on committing to reduce emissions, on protecting our wildlife and our plants and our planet.
Well done, Nicky. I'm so grateful to my honourable friend, because she gives me the opportunity to point out that is this government that is doubling spending on climate change to £11.6 billion over the next 5 years. That is a colossal sum, more than any other country. We are leading the world in tackling climate change and setting a blistering pace for our friends and partners across the world. And we are able to do that. We're able to do that, Mr. Speaker, because we support a dynamic free market economy, and that is how we're able to fund education across the country, because we believe that is the best way to create and spread opportunity, and not as the right honourable gentleman opposite would do, to set out to mutilate that system by banning all fee-paying schools and thereby saddling the taxpayer with a £7 billion bill. We want to give every parent the confidence that comes from properly inspecting schools, and I think it's frankly insane, Mr. Speaker, to scrap Ofsted with no plan to put anything in its place, when parents rely on Ofsted to keep their kids safe. And it's because we One Nation Conservatives believe in opportunity that we insist on standards in schools, and we insist on investment, and it's to allow young people to make the most of their education and their talents, and to boost the productivity of all the UK, that we are embarking on the biggest programme of infrastructure investment for a generation. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman opposite, and then to my honourable friend.
I thank him for giving way. In terms of educational opportunities, how does he think young people's opportunities are going to be affected when the aerospace, the chemical industries, Food and Drink Association have written to him saying the manufacturing sector is going to be very badly damaged by his deal, an industry that employs over 1 million people and is worth just under 100 billion to the UK economy each year?
May I respectfully suggest to him that that might be a good reason, if it were true, which it isn't, but it would be a good reason for his party to support a deal in the course of the next few days. And I must say I find it most peculiar that the leader of the Liberal Democrats has been off to see Mr. Barnier in Brussels to beg him not to give this country a deal. A really quite extraordinary state of affairs. We believe in boosting the productivity of every part of this country, including particularly Cheltenham. I give way to
Schools in Cheltenham, and teachers in particular, are doing a fantastic job of driving up standards, whilst at the same time coping with a dramatic increase in the demand for special educational needs. Does the Prime Minister agree that this is a Queen's speech which meets that demand with huge additional investment to allow schools to go as far as their pupils' talents will take them?
Thank you. My honourable friend is entirely right, and that is why there is a massive increase, not just in primary school funding, not just in secondary school funding, but also in SEND funding across the country, giving local people the power to set up special educational needs schools where they desire, and we will fund them and we will support them. I give way happily to my honourable friend.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way, and I know he's visited St Albans and found it fabulous, but my St Albans private schools, one of the oldest in the country, are hugely worried about this grab on their assets that's been proposed by the Leader of the Opposition. Can he give all private schools the reassurance that they're not just the first of the charitable organisations, that their assets are under attack from the gentleman opposite?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and of course that is not the only act of wanton expropriation, theft by the public sector of the private sector that is envisaged. A massive £196 billion programme of nationalisation is what they want to do. The destruction they would wreak on the UK economy. We, by contrast, Mr. Speaker, want to boost the productivity of the whole of the UK with massive investment, Northern Powerhouse Rail. We will do it. We've begun it. We will begin it. We will banish the rattling old Pacer trains. We will invest in roads across the country and fleets of clean, green buses, because we understand that that is the way to create the platform for economic growth. If you have great infrastructure, you have great transport connectivity and gigabit broadband, then you have the environment in which business can flourish. And we need business to flourish, don't we? They don't like business, but we need business to flourish, not just for the tax yield, but because so many solutions to our problems, not least environmental problems, are provided by the free market. By the free market, by capitalism. And if you look at the battery technology in which this country now leads the world, or you look at the designs for wind turbines or solar panels in which this country also lead the world, it isn't government that makes this stuff. Yes, of course, government must lead and create the right fiscal and regulatory framework. But our vision on this side of the House is of a nation full of innovators and entrepreneurs and startups. And that is how the green economy will not only take this country forward, that is how we will become carbon neutral by 2050. That is how we'll do it. And that is the point that is understood by proud free market conservatives, including, as the right honourable gentleman was kind enough to point out earlier on in his remarks, including by some of my relatives who joined my crustier relatives, I should say, who joined the protests in the last few days, but understand the vital importance of free market economics for delivering the solutions we need. And what would Labour do, by contrast? They avowedly wish to destroy capitalism. He wants to foment the overthrow of capitalism. And not just that, he wants to whack up taxes on virtually everything from income tax to pensions tax to inheritance tax, the highest corporation tax in Europe they envisage, and a £196 billion programme of renationalisation. And worst of all, I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm most grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way, and I'm listening to his exposition of the merits of free market capitalism. Can he tell me, can he tell the House, when was the transition to this position from his previous position, which was to F business?
Mr. Speaker, the destruction that Labour would do to business is, I think, the single gravest concern that this country faces, far greater than any fears that they may have had about a no deal Brexit. And worst of all, Mr. Speaker, for the certainty of business and for the confidence of business, this opposition, were they ever to obtain power, what would they do? They would simply delay Brexit. And they would delay Brexit with yet more paralysis and pointless procrastination. So I say, Mr. Speaker, I say to the House, let's not wait. We can't wait. Let's get Brexit done so we can take back control of our money, our borders and our laws. Let's get Brexit done so we can regulate differently and better, getting life-saving medicines faster and more cheaply to market for the NHS, galvanising coastal areas with a constellation of new free ports, organising our immigration system ourselves so that we are open to talent, open to scientists. Come on, I will give way to the honourable.
The Prime Minister talks about getting Brexit done, but he really knows that it's a painful journey and not an end point. And why, on that point, has he not included the trade bill to enable this House to scrutinise trade bills that will come week after week after week to this government, and we won't be able to see them, so we'll end up importing hormone-impregnated food, asbestos and the like. Where is the trade bill?
Grateful to the honourable gentleman. I can reassure him by saying that the trade bill is in the Queen's speech, and I hope very much that we can count on his support in voting for any deal that we might secure and in getting Brexit done. Our approach, I give way with pleasure.
I thank the Prime Minister so much for giving way. One of the things that my constituents care deeply about is social care, so I welcome the proposals that he set out in the Queen's speech. Does he agree this is why we must get Brexit done, so we can focus on the needs of the most vulnerable people in society?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is completely right, and I think there are people in this entire country are yearning for this House to come together, to work together and get Brexit done. And if we can get a deal, I think it will be the will of the people of this country for us to move that deal forward, because that is the way to get on with the priorities of the British people, not just controlling immigration, but also ensuring that we look after the interests of young people growing up in this country, give them the skills and investment that they need to match their talents. And I will give way with pleasure to the right honourable lady, and then to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. He talks about Brexit, of course, though we all know that whichever way you do Brexit, it's going to reduce jobs and our future prosperity. Is that why there is no mention of HS2B in the Queen's speech? Has he given up? Yes, I know. He's having to ask what HS2B is. That's the line via Towton in my constituency to Leeds that will serve the East Midlands and indeed Yorkshire. Has the government now given up on that vital piece of infrastructure?
Because I'm grateful to my right honourable lady. She knows there is a review going on of HS2, but this is a government that will be conducting the biggest infrastructure revolution of our times, and I suggest that she contains her impatience until the Chancellor unveils his budget on November the 6th, and I give way to my own.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. When I was re-elected in the 2017 election, myself and all of the MPs around me, including the Labour MPs, were elected on a very clear pledge to deliver Brexit. So can he assure me that he will not tolerate any of the attempts to get a second referendum? Because a second referendum is about one thing. It's about giving backward on that solemn pledge that we gave in the 2017 election to respect that result.
Mr. Speaker, I concur entirely with my honourable friend. If there could be one thing more divisive, more toxic than the first referendum, it would be a second referendum. Let's get Brexit done. I give way to the father of that.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister. Going back to the very important question raised by the Right Honourable Lady from Roxton, it's very important to our region of the country. He has announced a review of HS2, which I understand, but I hope that he's given no commitments during his leadership election about the future of that project. Will he ensure that that review does carefully consult on the economic impact of the East Midlands, Nottingham, Derbyshire and Leicestershire particularly, if the whole project of the HS2 to Leeds and the developments at Towton were abandoned?
I can certainly give the father of the House exactly that assurance. Mr. Speaker, the objective of Brexit is not just to give business the certainty of concluding this whole affair. It is, of course, to get on, as I say, take back control of our borders, our money, our laws, to enable us to champion our food and farming sectors in the way that we would desire, to alleviate perhaps the unnecessary burdens of bureaucracy that farming sometimes faces in this country. Let's take back control of our fisheries so that Scotland can make proper use of her incredible marine wealth. And I wonder, and I'm delighted to give way to a great campaigner for Scottish fishing.
Right, honourable friend, for giving way on this very important point, as he's well aware from my constituency. But does he also agree that the new fisheries bill will not
moving HS2 out of Edinburgh, where he could save £100 million on the route and invest it in energy efficiency infrastructure projects.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for her intervention. I must direct her back to the answer I gave a moment ago. We are looking very carefully at HS2, and I think she should wait until the review concludes. Mr. Speaker, we have a vision of a balanced and just and fair society where we fight crime but demand justice for victims, where we educate in prison and demand rehabilitation, where we fund superb education and healthcare, not in spite of our belief in the free market. Again, he flinches. He flinches at the mention of the free market. But because we understand that a dynamic wealth-creating economy is essential to pay for those public goods. That is the vision for the society I believe in. A generous, tolerant, outward-looking and humane society. That is the vision at the core of this Queen's speech, and I commend it to the House.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, yes. Appeal to honourable and right honourable members who are leaving the chamber to do so quickly and quietly, so that the rest of us can afford the right honourable gentleman the courtesy to which he is entitled. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin my response to the Queen's speech, I'm sure you're aware of the news from Spain today. That a number of Catalan politicians that have been arguing for self-determination, including a former Speaker of that Parliament, have been imprisoned. Mr. Speaker, it is right that politicians here and elsewhere throughout the world have the rights to argue for self-determination. And I'm proud to say that the Scottish National Party conference meeting today in Aberdeen has passed a motion in solidarity with our friends in Catalonia. Mr. Speaker, we stand with the Catalans that have been imprisoned for standing up for the rights of self-determination. Mr. Speaker, I rise to respond to the Queen's speech, and in the usual tradition I would like to pay tribute to the member for North East Derbyshire, who talked about the longest Parliament session since the Civil War, although I do wonder if he's talking about the Civil War in the Conservative Party.
That's still ongoing.
And indeed, which is still ongoing. And also indeed the... Well, actually, no, there is no civil war in the SNP. I think you will find that the SNP is absolutely united. I would also like to congratulate the member for Truro and for Falmouth, who talked about singing, and I'm sure members of the SNP could give a number of suggestions, perhaps Ode to Europe or indeed Freedom Camoyi. Mr. Speaker, moving on to the very serious situation that we find ourselves in today. We have entered very dark days. Mr. Speaker, in just 17 days, the UK is set to leave the European Union. I want to take some time to reflect with the House on why the actions of this government are leading to such a tragedy. And, Mr. Speaker, I do not use my words lightly. Leaving the European Union is a tragedy. At the inception of the European community, it was stated that the contribution which an organised and living Europe can bring to civilization is indispensable to the maintenance of peaceful relations. And, you know, maybe the Prime Minister might actually show some respect to the debate rather than sitting and laughing about those that established the European community. The European community was born in the aftermath of the Second World War, after two devastating world wars that brought death, destruction and misery. The European Union is the greatest example of political cooperation and of peace. Leaving behind the scars of war, the pain of loss, and instead choosing to take the hand of friendship across this continent. The United Kingdom joined with European partners to say never, not ever again, would we compromise peace and stability, and that the European Union would work as a beacon of hope and a guiding light for continued peace, to avoid conflict and the loss of more lives. That is the European Union, Mr. Speaker, that my colleagues here are so proud of. Mr. Speaker, for decades, the United Kingdom has played its role as an equal partner with member states across Europe in the pursuit of inclusion, of tolerance, of solidarity, of freedom and of peace. Through the European Union, we have prioritised human dignity, worked together to deliver equality, protected human rights and preserved the importance of the rule of law and of democracy. I will happily give way.
Thank you for giving way. How would he rate the performance of the common fisheries policy over the last few years?
I'm going to come on to fishing and agriculture. But you know, when I'm talking about the principles of what the European Union has meant to peace and stability, that's the response that we get from the Conservatives. That, quite frankly, is quite telling, and I have to say, I am amazed that the honourable member that I have respect for has lowered himself to a situation where he's talking about fishing, when we are talking about peace and stability that the European Union have brought us. Mr. Speaker, I will in 1 second. Mr. Speaker, we have not yet left the European Union, and yet we have already have a preview to the Prime Minister's contempt for democracy and the lack of respect for the rule of law. Leaving the European Union risks the protection, the rights and the values that have made our democracy possible. The rights that we have all shared as EU citizens. To live, to work, to receive an education in each member state are about to be torn from us if this government gets its way. Rights that perhaps that many of us have taken for granted. The great right of freedom of movement, to be stopped by a government in its own warped sense that it somehow sees this as a victory. I'll give way first to my honourable friend.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. We have our political differences, but the fact is the right honourable gentleman represents the biggest constituency in the UK, and I represent the second biggest. When it comes to fisheries, the EU over many years has paid for whole harbours like Kinloch Bervie, paid for roads, paid for airports, paid for bridges. Is it not utterly reprehensible that there's nothing in the Prime Minister's plan to replace this crucial money for my constituents?
I thank my honourable friend, and I didn't think we had that many differences, but there we are. But, you know, he's absolutely right. As I travel around Roskilde and Lochaber, and as he travels around Caithness and Sutherland, it's absolutely the case that the signs are everywhere as to what the European Union has brought to our constituents. The signs of the investment that Europe has brought to our constituents. The European Union citizens that have found a home in our constituents, those that are prepared to say that the Highlands and Islands are their home, and we are also glad to welcome them as part of our community.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Just to turn back to freedom of movement for 1 second, because it happens so often that members of the benches opposite, historically illiterate, so they are, that they cheer the ending of the freedom of movement in this country. Isn't it the case that freedom of movement remains and will probably always be the greatest economic, social, cultural and peaceful diplomatic achievement anywhere, not just in Europe, but frankly anywhere in the world?
My honourable friend is quite correct, and we celebrate all of those that have come to live in our countries, given our membership of the European Union. And I stand as someone that's worked in the Netherlands. My son lived and worked in the Netherlands. My grandchildren are losing the automatic rights to live, to work, to get an education, to benefit culturally from everything that Europe has meant. And why? Because of the narrow ideology of the Brexit fanboys that sit on the government benches. Mr. Speaker, the rights that we have all shared as EU citizens to live, to work, to receive an education, as I said, are about to be taken from us. Rights that perhaps that many of us have taken for granted. That great right of free movement is to be stopped. That is a backward, retrograde, isolationist step. Brexit poses a serious, significant and lasting threat to democracy and the values that we cherish. Mr. Speaker, I stand here today not only as a Member of Parliament for Ross, Skye and Lochaber and as the SNP Westminster leader. I stand here as a Social Democrat and a proud European who wholeheartedly believes in peaceful cooperation across these islands and across the continent. Mr. Speaker, I am deeply saddened. In truth, I am, like many across these countries, I am frightened. Frightened of the future that this Prime Minister and this government are planning for citizens across Scotland and across the United Kingdom. The term crisis, chaos, catastrophe are now everyday terminology in the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, this is alarming. I fear that the past few years have numbed many of us to a looming disaster, to a no-deal Brexit, and to the real dangers of the vote leave occupants in number 10. Britain is in a difficult position, with a dangerous Prime Minister who has no majority and no mandate for office. He and his toxic party must be stopped. Mr. Speaker, today the Prime Minister has vowed to make the UK the greatest place on earth. The greatest place on earth. That is a comment straight out of the Trump playbook, and it's celebrated by the member for Stirling. That just about says it all. Mr. Speaker, members across this House, across Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom know that neither Donald Trump or the Prime Minister have a hope of making America or the United Kingdom great again, simply because both egotists are obsessed only with making life for Trump and for the Prime Minister great again. I'll give her.
Very much. Can you tell the House what is wrong with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom wanting to make this country the greatest place on earth to live?
I'll tell you what is wrong with what the Prime Minister's bringing forward, because he wants to bring a catastrophe of a no-deal Brexit. And the hard facts of the matter...
Order! Order! I don't know whether it's something to do with the melodic susurrations emitted by the leader of the Scottish National Party, but there is an unfailing tendency of the government backbenches to holler at the right honourable gentleman in a most overexcitable, bordering upon demented fashion. Calm yourselves. There is a long way to go, and nothing on earth will prevent the right honourable gentleman continuing his speech until its conclusion. So lie back and think of either England or Scotland and get used to it, Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but perhaps the leader of the House might need a little bit more space if he's to lie back as he's prone to do. But no, look, this is a serious matter, because we know that if Scotland is taken out of the European Union against its will, that it will cost us up to 100,000 jobs. We know, because the government's told us, through the Yellowhammer document, that there is a threat to the supply of food, that there's a threat to the supply of medicines. And now we have the Chief Medical Officer for England telling us there is a threat to lives. And at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, it is the government that's responsible for this. It is the Prime Minister that has it within his gift to recognise the calamity of what a no-deal Brexit would be, to stand up in this House today to say that he will respect the rule of law, that he will respect the Benn Act, And under no circumstances, Mr Speaker, will we be leaving the European Union on a no-deal basis at the end of October, because that, Prime Minister, would be an act of dignity. That would be an act that respects the rule of law. And I'll happily give the Prime Minister the opportunity, if he so chooses, to rise now and to tell the House that he will respect the law, that he is never, ever above the law. Well, there we are. There's the answer that the House needs. Mr Speaker, it is, well, he might be tying his laces, but he's tying the Conservative Party in knots. It is worth noting that 10 of the bills introduced by the UK Government during the 2017-19 session did not complete their passage through Parliament, emphasising the chaos at the heart of this government, despite the length of the session. Mr Speaker, in contrast, just last month, the Scottish Government set out its latest programme for government and continues to pass progressive legislation such as the Climate Change Act, committing Scotland to being a net zero society by 2045. Today announcing 22 bills, this government is not truly proposing a pathway for governance, it is a blatant egotistical electioneering. Another Tory toxic agenda, presenting wish lists for a Prime Minister who carries no majority in Parliament. This government's top priority is to leave the... You know, Mr Speaker, it gets a bit rich for someone who's behaving as if he's a barrack room lawyer, shouting out repeatedly. And I tell you what, I look forward to the members of Stirling being able to give their judgment on the behaviour of the individual. Mr Speaker, the government's top priority is to leave the European Union, shows contempt for the majority view of Scotland that we should remain in the European Union. And it's about time that those that are temporarily here from Scottish seats representing the Tories, recognising that they should be standing up for the people of Scotland that want to stay in the European Union, not stabbing them in the back. Mr Speaker, these legislative proposals will be devastating for Scotland. Despite the rouge and the fanfare around today, the Prime Minister isn't really interested in delivering a new legislative programme. He's only interested in showcasing his party's manifesto. And what a regressive manifesto it is. The speech is a missed opportunity to address years of austerity and punishing cuts in social security support. We call it social security, by the way. You call it welfare, and that's the difference. It completely failed to address the social security disaster the Tories have overseen since 2010. Mr Speaker, the Scottish National Party is clear that universal credit should be radically reformed, and the absolutely disgraceful two-child cap on child tax credits, along with the appalling rape clause, must be scrapped immediately. It is astonishing that this government continues to pursue a policy on inflicting hardship and economic harm on people across the United Kingdom. The sheer hypocrisy that this speech is heavy on law and order from a Prime Minister that's prepared to break the law. You really couldn't make it up. Found by the Supreme Court to have given unlawful advice to the Queen. Then the Prime Minister told the Commons he would not abide by the Benn Act. However, he then gave a sworn promise to the Scottish courts that he would obey the law and issue a letter for extension if no deal is agreed by the 19th of October. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister must deliver that letter, or I will give him this promise: he'll find himself back in the courts next week and answerable to him. Then, of course, on Thursday the 3rd of October, the Prime Minister told the Commons his proposals would not create physical infrastructure on the Irish border. which the Taoiseach then called out, stating simply that United Kingdom proposals would mean infrastructure on the border. Mr. Speaker, many across the UK will find it hard to stomach a Prime Minister talking about law and order when he himself shows the rule of law absolutely no respect.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. In terms of law and order, would my right honourable friend agree that the Conservative Party has lost any shred of reputation with regards to keeping our communities safe? In constituencies like mine, within Slough, knife crime and violent crime is the highest on record, whereby communities are no longer feeling safe because more than 21,000 police officers have been cut, 7,000 PCSOs, 5,000 specials. That is why we need to get rid of this Conservative government. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. He makes a great deal of sense, because the harsh reality is that the Conservative government has cut police numbers alarmingly over the course of the last 7 years. And it stands in direct contrast to the performance of my government, my Scottish government, that has increased police numbers in Scotland and has recognised the challenge that violent crime, that knife crime has meant, and how we have dealt with that in a progressive manner north of the border. So he's absolutely correct. And of course, in the context of everything that we're discussing today, we cannot ignore the behaviour that's exhibited in this place, and in particular the language that is used. The language of the surrender bill, accusing those of us that wish to stay in the European Union that our constituents have voted for that we are collaborators. And yet the Prime Minister and his cronies talk about freedom of speech and blithely ignore the abuse, the online threats, the death threats that many honourable... Mr. Speaker, I have to say I find it remarkable that there are many members of this House that have spoken eloquently of the death threats they have faced. And what we had from the government benches was loud guffawing. The fact that we lost a member of this House a few short years ago, and we have this kind of behaviour. There are too many members of this House that are being threatened. And the behaviour that is exhibited in this place, is a clarion call to those that wish to send threats to members of Parliament. And I appeal to everyone, I absolutely appeal to everyone, to think about where we are, to think about the importance of the next few days. And all of us, and I mean all of us, have a responsibility of calling out misbehaviour whenever it happens. For all across the House, whichever party it comes from, we have a duty to make sure that we create respectful debate and dialogue. And I commit myself and my party exactly to that. I will give him that.
The right honourable gentleman for giving way. He makes a powerful point about the way that we conduct ourselves in this place, and I'm sure he'll agree with me. It's absolutely beholden on all of us that we are careful with our language, and that includes the language of our supporters. And I have had abusive, well, goodness knows, Mr. Speaker, I've had all sorts of abusive texts from all sorts of people. But I have to tell the honourable gentleman that includes supporters of his own party. Well, honourable members opposite shouldn't get too excited, because I've had them from, supporters from that side of the argument as well. So wherever it happens, whoever it comes from, it has to stop.
Can I thank my right honourable friend? And I absolutely agree with every word that she said. And it's absolutely important that all of us have got the stance that must be taken as we call out abuse wherever it comes from. Wherever it comes from, it is not acceptable. And as political leaders, because we are all political leaders in this place, we need to get away from the toxic environment that we live in today. And, Mr. Speaker, I make it clear that we believe that our days in this place are numbered, because we want Scotland to become an independent country in Europe. But the one promise, the one commitment that I give is that I want to. There's going to be a hard border. You know, you couldn't make this up, could you? We're actually trying to deal. We're trying to deal with the issue of abuse in politics, and someone shouts out, "Will there be a hard border?" The point I was just about to make is that as far as we can possibly achieve, I want any debate on Scottish independence to be respectful. It has to be about the future of our country. It has to be respectful of all points of opinions. And everybody has a responsibility to make sure that takes place.
I'm very grateful to him. One of the most depressing sets of conversations I've had in the last few days is talking to members who've decided not to stand at the next general election, because a number of them have said that they're not going to do so because they are frightened either for themselves or for their families, or more often for their staff. And I just wondered, regardless of this conversation about how we conduct ourselves in here and elsewhere, it just seems to me ludicrous that it has now taken more than 3 years for IPSA and the House authorities to be able to come together to agree protocols for making sure that there are proper security arrangements in every constituency, home and constituency office. Is it not time we just got that right?
Ian Blackford.
Can I commend the Right Honourable Member, because he speaks with absolute sense, and we have to give consignments to what is going on. I suspect there are not many members of this place that haven't had threats, many of them up to death threats. Let's be under no illusion. This is increasing. We all know it's increasing. And of course we need to make sure in particular that our staff members get protection. We've got to cool the temperature in this place. We have to accept the position of leadership that we all have. We are going to be going through some absolutely challenging days over the course of the next few days. Let's show some responsibility. Let's show leadership of what is a time of crisis.
Hear, hear.
I am grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way, because he asked members of this House to call out misbehaviour. Would misbehaviour be the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the SNP, saying that the SNP want to radically reform welfare, but don't actually want the powers transferred from this House to Holyrood? Would it be the Leader of the SNP trying to say that Scotland's crime figures are better when serious and violent crime is at its highest level in Scotland under the SNP? And would he also agree that the SNP Scottish Government, led by Nicola Sturgeon, dodges the big ideas, makes bad policies worse and makes good policies bad? Not my words, but the words of Robin McAlpine, the Yes supporter, in an interview this weekend, who said the biggest impediment to independence is the SNP.
Did you start listening to him? Very desperate.
You know, it's not my job to give advice to the Scottish Conservatives, but I would respectfully say it might be a bit better if you try to engage positively and proactively in the position that Scotland is in.
I'm grateful for my Right Honourable friend for giving way, and I'll ask him a question about the United Kingdom Government's Queen's speech. In the Queen's speech placed before the House by the Prime Minister, it says, "As the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, my government will ensure that it continues to play a leading role in global affairs, defending its interests and promoting its values." Does my Right Honourable friend agree that leaving the European Union diminishes the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland's position, and plays no part in supporting people like my constituent Jagtar Singh Johal and Azim Zaharia Radcliffe in determining their freedom and ability to return home, while this government diminishes the role of the United Kingdom in the global order?
I have to say, and I take no joy out of this, that my honourable friend is absolutely correct. And we should be discussing Nazanin. The fact that Nazanin's daughter has come home, and we are grateful that that is the case. But where is the government intervention on these matters? And there is no question that our voice internationally will be diminished, the fact that we are not round the table with our European partners. Mr. Speaker, I know I've taken a number of interventions and I must move on, and I will yeah, right. Let's move on. Mr. Speaker, nothing in this speech that we've had from the government today is designed to enhance the rights of Scotland, our Parliament, or the voices of the Scottish people. Most notable is the fact that this government plans to reintroduce an agricultural bill and a fisheries bill, showing contempt for our devolution settlement, seeking to sideline and silence the voices of Scotland. What we saw under the Prime Minister's predecessor were that powers were removed from Scotland without the consent of the Scottish Parliament over fisheries and agriculture. Powers that the Scottish people had voted for back in our devolution referendum in 1997, taken back to Westminster without the consent of the people of Scotland. I want to firmly put on record that the Scottish National Party, while here in Westminster and in Scotland, will do all that we can do to resist the downgrading and the dismissal of our devolved rights and powers. When Westminster talks of taking back control, they're talking about taking back control of fishing and agriculture, not from the EU, but from Scotland. Mr. Speaker, the day is coming, and coming fast, when the people of Scotland will have their say on Brexit Britain, or whether they wish to be an independent country in Europe. Let me remind the Prime Minister, who isn't in his place, he seems to have gone, despite the protocol he's supposed to be here for 2 speeches after he finishes, but let me remind him of the words of Parnell. No man shall fix the right to fix the boundary to the march of a nation. Prime Minister, you must heed those words. Mr. Speaker, not satisfied with their hostile environment, this Tory government wants to legislate to end freedom of movement once and for all. Not only is that morally deplorable, it is economically nonsensical. In Scotland, our economy relies on immigration to support key public services, not least including our health service. EU citizens from out with the UK living in Scotland make up 3.9% of our population and 5% of our population. They enrich our culture, strengthen our society and boost our economy. Mr. Speaker, leaving the EU and ending freedom of movement could cost Scotland up to £2 billion in lost tax revenues. Restricting the rights and freedoms of citizens to come to Scotland will risk the delivery of key public services. But, Mr. Speaker, what do we expect from the Tories? Closing up borders isn't driven by fact or reason, but by an ideological, fundamental position from the governing party that immigration is bad. We've seen this fundamentalism in practice recently from the government, as they refuse to automatically guarantee permanent residence to all EU nationals in the UK along with their families. This government is risking leading us into another Windrush scandal, making life impossible for thousands of EU nationals. The UK government should be working to keep citizens here and enable a fairer immigration system to deal with sectoral needs across Scotland and the UK, rather than focusing on forcing people to leave their homes here. The Conservatives need to stop playing with people's lives and drop the hostile environment once and for all. Mr. Speaker, the long-awaited pensions bill has appeared in today's announcement.
On that point, I thank my right honourable friend for taking that intervention, and I wonder if he's as confused as I am in that, listening to the Queen's speech and hearing the Prime Minister talk about the economic opportunities and how our economy is thriving under this Conservative government, how they can still somehow not find the money for women born in the 1950s who paid in for their pension and have not received a penny back. Does he agree that this is completely unjustified and that the Prime Minister would do well to remember that all these women have votes in this election that he seems so desperate to get?
My honourable friend is quite correct. There are 3.8 million women that are affected by these pensions changes. And we've been over this time and time again. The lack of notice that was given, in some cases only 14 months. The fact that some women have lost years of pension entitlement, in some cases tens of thousands of pounds. The callousness the lack of consideration, the fact that many of these women are suffering is absolutely disgraceful, and they've had nothing but contempt from this government.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I totally agree with what he said about the women's pensions in the early 50s. Because he noticed something else that's been missing in the Queen's speech. Nothing given the Prime Minister's commitment to do something about pensioners' television licences. There's nothing in the Queen's speech about that either. Would you not agree with me? It should have been in the Queen's speech.
I very often agree with the honourable gentleman. I absolutely agree with him on this. There ought to be a commitment in the Queen's speech that those that are over 75 will have their TV licence paid by the government. So my question to the Prime Minister is, where is it? Let's have that signal to those that are aged over 75 that they're going to have the comfort of being able to watch television and the licence being paid.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. We've just heard about the attack on women born in the 1950s. We've heard about the assault on the free TV licences, and we know about the changes to universal credit. Does he share my concern that this Queen's speech has done nothing to halt this relentless attack on pensioners?
Yep. Absolutely. And let me say to my honourable friend that pensioners will be better off in an independent Scotland than they are with this Conservative government. Mr. Speaker, what a missed opportunity that we've had in the Queen's speech. While the SNP welcomes progress on bringing forward legislation on the pensions dashboard, the bill falls short in a number of areas. The 1950s women that we have discussed. The government have a responsibility to address this hardship that has been visited on hundreds of thousands of women. It must be addressed in this legislation. It simply cannot go on any longer. Moreover, the Scottish National Party has consistently called for the establishment of an independent Pensions and Savings Commission to deal with policy gaps in delivering dignity in retirement. If the Prime Minister and his government are really interested in delivering on preparation for later life, then they need to get real. Not everyone has a Tory trust fund to fall back on. We need robust and responsive policy to deal with the crisis in pension saving that we simply can't wait for. So I plead to the government, don't mess this up. Establish the Commission and use the opportunity to deliver a pensions bill that actually delivers fairness for older people rather than uncertainty, complexity and hardship. Mr. Speaker, the government have said as part of their efforts they will bring forward a new environment bill to set legally binding targets to reduce the use of plastics, restore biodiversity, improve water quality and cut air pollution. And we on these benches, we say, just about time. But while the government at last have woken up to the reality of the climate crisis, the devil will be in the detail. Already, the United Kingdom government is lagging behind the Scottish Government with its commitment of ending the climate crisis. The SNP Scottish Government has already in place more robust targets, so I say to the Government, if it's ready to face the reality that our world demands action now, then follow the lead of the SNP Scottish Government. Mr. Speaker, members across the House know that the single market has been achieved by removing barriers to trade and having a single set of trade rules across all member states. I want to move on just because I'm conscious that other honourable and right honourable members want to speak. For businesses in Scotland, that means being able to sell their goods and services to 500 million people without paying any tariffs and without having to adhere to completely different rules in each country. Mr. Speaker, an estimated 300,000 jobs in Scotland rely on our trade with the rest of the UK. The Tory trade bill will end all the economic progress that's been made. Furthermore, not unexpectedly, the government has announced a bill on the withdrawal agreement, an agreement this government has yet to reach with the European Union or indeed with this House. Let's call it a fantasy bill. Yet the media reports suggest that the Prime Minister is looking to possibly legislate for the agreement on the 19th of October. That is this Saturday. Announcing on Monday a bill on an agreement that doesn't exist and expecting it to pass through this House on Saturday Mr. Speaker, what recklessness! The Prime Minister hasn't offered a Queen's speech today to set out his vision to protect our economy and communities from a disastrous no-deal Brexit, but instead to platform his election campaign days before he intends to drive the UK off the cliff edge. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is fooling no one. This isn't the beginning of a new Parliament, it is the end. And we in the SNP are absolutely crystal clear. We want it to end on our terms, not on the Prime Minister's. Deal or no deal, the Prime Minister is driving Scotland and the UK into economic catastrophe. His proposals do not keep Scotland in the single market and the customs union, and that will cripple our economy, risking jobs, livelihoods, and delivering a race to the bottom on fundamental rights. These are not acceptable to the SNP, nor should they be acceptable to this House. Mr. Speaker, there is a piece of legislation that should focus the minds of all members today. That is the Ben Act. In just 5 days, the Ben Act legally requires the Prime Minister to ask for an extension. His public utterances suggest that that will not happen. And we all know, that we cannot trust this Prime Minister to act in accordance with the law. We can't even trust him to turn up to Parliament. And I have to say, I am sceptical about the possibility of compromise. What exactly is the Prime Minister compromising, and who is he compromising with? Internally, the Prime Minister is seeking to play a crude numbers game, hoping a number of Labour backbenchers come to his rescue for any shoddy deal that he might be able to force through at the final hour. So I want to make the opposition of the Scottish National Party clear for the House, and I hope that the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the Liberal Democrats listen carefully. Because, Mr. Speaker, only by taking control of the House this week can we bring down and end the days of this government. That is the only way that we can assure that we can secure an extension and make sure that no deal cannot become a reality. We cannot wait and trust the Prime Minister and his cronies in Number 10. Any member in this House that caves in on bended knee to a deal cooked up by the Prime Minister are trying to escape the inescapable reality that any Brexit will destroy opportunities and the totality of relationships across these islands as we know them. We must stop this government riding roughshod over the rights and freedoms of all our citizens. We cannot allow a dangerous Prime Minister to remain in office. We cannot allow the Vote Leave campaign to suffocate Parliament into submission. We must resist. If opposition parties come together, we can take no deal off the table and resolve the deadlock once and for all by holding a general election to clear the decks. We must put our trust in the people. We must trust that after years of uncertainty, chaos and instability, that the public wants something better than this Tory government. That is our job. That is the job of any opposition, to oppose the government and to offer a better way. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish National Party will not pay into the Prime Minister's hands and partake in his charade. We will vote down this Queen's speech. We're not in the business of backing Tory manifesto pledges, nor should others be on these benches.
Tracy Crouch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a great privilege to speak at the start of this debate celebrating a new parliamentary session, especially after the paralysis of the domestic agenda since the last Queen's speech. And while recognising that we still have to deliver Brexit, and contrary to what the SNP leader was just saying, it is refreshing to have the opportunity to talk about other issues that mean a great deal to people outside of this place. There is much to welcome in the Queen's speech today, including further protections for our police officers, a possible ban on the import of hunting trophies, the continued passage of the Domestic Abuse Bill, the Animal Welfare Sentencing Bill and the Commonwealth Games Bill, making sure that Birmingham can deliver a spectacular event in 2022. Give way.
It was the
moment she mentioned the police, because, as she knows, in the last session of Parliament, we brought forward on a unanimous cross-party basis new legislation to protect the police and emergency workers. I hope that any new measures that there might be that affect the police from the Queen's speech might also affect all emergency workers, because the number of attacks on emergency workers is still growing. But my anxiety is that still the legislation that is already on the statute book isn't being fully enforced. Don't we need to do that as well?
I'm very pleased to support the honourable gentleman in that piece of legislation, and since then I now have a vested interest in that my nephew has joined the police. I think it's very important that we do protect our police officers, but indeed all our emergency workers who do an absolutely fantastic job as first responders, so I support him very much in that initiative. Now, Mr. Speaker, as someone who's working on a project to green a school in one of the most polluted parts of my constituency, a signatory to the Times Clean Air Act pledge and a member of the Conservative Environment Network, I very much welcome that the Environment Bill sets out binding clean air targets, as well as cutting plastic use, protecting biodiversity, reducing our carbon footprint and investing in better, cleaner technology. I hope that this bill will get full cross-party support in order to make its passage through Parliament swift, for the benefit of those, like some of my constituents, who live in unacceptably high polluted areas, but also for the future generations of this country. Yes, of course.
I'm listening carefully, and she'll know 2.6 million children live in or go to polluted schools. But will she accept that if we are to get to the World Health Organization guidelines by 2030, we will have to ban the sale of new diesel and petrol cars by 2030 and not 2042, as has been agreed in Sweden, Ireland and many other countries? Would you agree it should be 2030 if we're serious?
More gentleman, on the work that he's done on the Clean Air Act, I was pleased to come to an event that he sponsored in this House to sign up to the Times Pledge on that. And I very much agree with him in terms of how we protect children, particularly around schools, from high pollution. One school in my constituency is planning on having a protest to stop parents from driving their children to school, and I think that's something that he has campaigned on as well. So I support him on that, but I appreciate there is a lot more work that has to be done. Now, Mr. Speaker, I also welcome plans in the Queen's speech to update the Mental Health Act, but I hope it includes measures that will ensure that no person, absolutely no one, can be discharged from residential care without a care plan, as unfortunately I have several cases of this in my own constituency, which leads to heightened pressure for the families of those suffering from severe poor mental health. Of course.
I'm very kindly giving way on that point. Does she agree with Sir Simon Westley, who carried out the Mental Health Act review on behalf of the last Prime Minister, that it's not just about legislation change, but it also needs resources too? And if we're seriously going to affect the mental health challenge in this country, then according to Sir Simon Westley, we need £800 million extra to be going into our mental health services.
The Honourable Lady on all the work that she does on mental health and the changes that have happened since our time in this place together. I think we have seen some real progress, but I recognise that there is an issue around resourcing, but it's also about putting the right resources in the right places. And certainly I work very closely with my CCGs, but also other partners across my constituency to ensure that we are getting the right mental health support to those that need it most. And unfortunately, there are some real gaps in some of our mental health provision. For example, children under 11 in my area do get some really good support, but there is a gap in the support, for example, between 11 and 18, and that can be a real acute period of time. We don't necessarily have the right mental health support for men who are suffering from poor mental health, and we certainly don't have the right level of trained support for those who have been in the armed forces and have a very different way of a different type of mental health condition that requires that specialist care. So I think it is incumbent on all of us to look at the mental health proposals in the Queen's speech, look at the detail of those, and if required, work cross-party to ensure that we have a significant good piece of legislation. I can see the honourable gentleman wanting to intervene.
Well, I congratulate the Honourable Lady for chatting and the others for bringing forward our comments. And just to reiterate the last point she referred to the veterans and mental health, and the Honourable Lady has referred to it.
while there are many good charities, and while the Ministry of Defence do lots of good work, every week in my office, and perhaps even in the Honourable Lady's office as well, we find that there are many, many people who slip under the radar and are not caught. And does the Honourable Lady feel that within the legislation and the strategy going forward from government, that they will be able to capture these people and make sure that they are helped within the process, rather than falling between the stools and disappearing, and thereby their problems are never sorted?
Well, I agree entirely with the Honourable Gentleman. I think one of the issues that we have is sort of kind of making sure that people don't slip under the radar, but I think actually now that we are talking more about mental health than ever before, that hopefully there will be other ways of capturing those people and getting them into the support systems. One concern that I do have, which I just mentioned, however, is when they are in the system, and if they have a particularly severe mental health condition, that if they have spent some time in a residential unit, that when they are discharged, they're not being discharged with the right level of care plan or home visits, and that is something that is not fair on the person who's suffering from poor mental health, nor is it fair on their families and loved ones trying to support them. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's a bill in the Queen's Speech which I very much support, but again look forward to seeing the detail, and that is of the new offences bill. It is right that we increase the prison sentences for those found guilty of serious violent and sexual offences, but I hope it includes reforms relating to the Misuse of Sexual Offences Act, bringing sports coaches in line with the rules relating to teachers. And also, I hope that it finally increases the sentences for those who cause death by dangerous driving. Now, I've been lobbying for an increase, having had a desperately sad case in my constituency, but unfortunately one that is not unique, raised with me by a local resident who tragically lost their son. This is something that we made a commitment to back in 2017, but as yet hasn't had parliamentary time given to it, so I hope that now we can do that. But I can only imagine how difficult it must be to deal with the loss of a loved one in such horrendous circumstances. Knowing that justice has been served must be an important part of coming to terms with that loss. And after such a welcome announcement 2 years ago, but the subsequent delay, I very much hope that the government can finally bring forward these measures before Parliament as soon as possible, which I'm sure will have broad support across this House. Now, these measures could have been easily set alongside other issues relating to road safety, for example, and I would like to have seen more work on this area of domestic policy. Mr. Speaker, after a constituent's partner was killed while recovering another vehicle from the M25, I, alongside my right honourable friend for Hemel Hempstead, have been campaigning for greater protections for those who work to rescue those who have broken down on our road network. These include minor changes to traffic regulations, allowing recovery vehicles to use red lights rather than amber, but it also includes a full-scale review of our smart motorway network. I've actively campaigned against the rollout of the smart motorway on the M20 as I'm not convinced of its safety. Now, I've seen and heard Highways England statistics, but I share the view of the coroner for Birmingham Solihull, who was presiding over the sad death of an 8-year-old boy killed in an incident on the M6, that there needs to be greater clarity on the safety of the smart motorway network, including a vastly improved system to recognise stranded vehicles. I feel deeply uncomfortable with the concept of smart motorways as they effectively strip a driver of the option to pull over. With motorways having a high proportion of heavier vehicles on them, even a collision at a slower speed of a large vehicle with a stranded smaller vehicle can have fatal consequences. A review in this Queen's Speech would have been very much welcomed by drivers, roadside recovery workers, and of course the families of victims, and I hope it will be considered for a future legislative programme. A bill to replace the rail franchising system is very welcome. Long-suffering commuters in Kent have been left in limbo about the future of the South Eastern franchise as the competition was delayed and delayed and delayed again by DfT and eventually cancelled altogether in August this year. Neither does it seem all that long ago that the franchise timetable was torn up following the Brown Review in 2013, which resulted in a 50-month extension to the current franchise. Ultimately, it is the passenger who loses out from all this uncertainty created by a chaotic franchising system. And Kent MPs have lobbied hard for improvements to the service and welcome much of what was included in it as part of the new franchise proposals, including greater capacity. However, with passengers facing ever-increasing rail fares, it is time these improvements were actually delivered. On a very specific matter relating to my constituency, Since becoming an MP in 2010, and along with colleagues in West Kent, I've lobbied for improved services to the city on the Maidstone East line. This was due to be introduced in December this year with a new Thameslink service, and we wrote to the Secretary of State in May and again in September for assurances that this would be delivered. It was therefore desperately disappointing to be told that rollout would not in fact take place as planned in December, and incredibly with no concrete assurances about when it would happen in the future. While bitterly disappointing for passengers, it is unfortunately entirely in keeping with the complete shambles of our rail franchising system, and anything which creates more transparency and, critically, accountability, including stricter penalties, is to be welcomed. It's about time we had a rail franchising system that works for the passenger and not the rail industry. But rail is just one part of our creaking infrastructure, and one area of domestic policy that I would like to have seen legislation on relates to roads. Now, I should be lobbying the Chancellor hard for more funding for Kent roads, including major investment in Junction 3 on the M2 and Junctions 5 and 6 on the M20. But with the prospect of the Lower Thames crossing coming on stream, it is essential that we invest now to minimise the negative impact of increased traffic going through my constituency and indeed the county as a whole. Mr. Speaker, it is important that we don't forget that there is a world beyond Brexit. I welcome our new domestic agenda and hope that it passes next week so we can get on with delivering on our pledges to improve the lives of our constituents.
Juice Winson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Chatham and Aylesford. Particularly, I think her remarks on the importance of mental health are definitely worth listening to. On behalf of my colleagues on these ever-expanding Liberal Democrat benches, I would also like to associate ourselves with the words of both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition about Paul Flynn. He was a thoughtful man, an independent spirit who spoke truth to power, and he will be remembered with great affection. I would also like, Mr. Speaker, to spend a moment remembering another former member of this House who we said farewell to in the last year, the former MP for Yeovil, who was leader of the Liberal Democrats for 11 years, Paddy Ashdown. He led an energetic life of public service in the Special Forces, in this House and indeed the other place, and indeed in his role in Bosnia. He was bold, fearless and determined, and he is very much missed. I'd like to pay tribute to the mover and seconder of the humble address. The Honourable Member for North East Derbyshire took us on a grand tour from Derbyshire to Venezuela, and I think he has surely guaranteed himself good coverage in tomorrow's Times Red Box by quoting the favourite catchphrase of Matt Chorley, "This is not normal." As a fellow child of the 1980s, I would just like to put on record my thanks to him for confirming to the House that 39 is clearly still considered up and coming. The Honourable Member for Truro and Falmouth is a well-respected former minister, liked on all sides of the House for the way in which she genuinely engages. I understand from looking at her Wikipedia entry that she was also head girl at school. She then graduated with a history degree from King's College London and then a master's as a Rotary scholar. Some might call her a girly swat. I would say to her that she should know that at least from these benches that is meant as a compliment. I did start to worry slightly, however, when she mentioned Colleen Rooney, and I was grateful that she didn't seek the House's opinion on the recent Instagram controversy, because surely we have had enough division, though perhaps next time the Prime Minister needs someone to do a leak inquiry, there is an obvious candidate there. It's perhaps a sign of our political times that the humble address was proposed by a Leaver who has 3 times voted with me against a Brexit deal, and seconded by a Remainer who has 3 times voted for a deal to leave the European Union. On these occasions, it is of course traditional to try to lighten the mood with the odd joke. And I see that even the Queen today managed to include something to make us all laugh when she said, "The government's new economic plan will be underpinned by a responsible fiscal strategy." Because this Queen's speech is predicated on the UK leaving the European Union in just over 2 weeks. And analysis after analysis shows this will leave a massive hole in the public finances.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, much of the last 3 years has felt a little bit like Groundhog Day for many of us. But there was something about the last week that has felt particularly familiar to me. And then it dawned on me. We've all been sat in meetings where a woman puts forward an idea and it gets shouted down. A little later, a man suggests virtually the same thing and pretends it was his great idea all along. But the Liberal Democrats are crystal clear. Whether it is a hard or soft Brexit, whether it comes with a red rosette or a blue rosette, whether it's proposed by the former Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, or the Leader of the Opposition, there is no form of Brexit that will be good for our country. And the Liberal Democrats will continue to fight to stop Brexit, to secure a people's vote with the option to remain in the European Union, to give the public the final say on the Brexit deal. Because there is no deal that will ever be as good as the one we currently have as members of the European Union. Mr. Speaker, there was nothing in this Queen's speech that will bring comfort to the factory worker set to lose their job, or to the many thousands who already have. Nothing to bring comfort to families when they're having to pay more and more to put food on the table. Nothing to bring comfort to our young people who are being stripped of the right to live, work and study in 27 other countries. Nothing to bring comfort to our NHS on the cusp of yet another winter crisis and having lost more than 5,000 EU nurses in the last 2 years. And nothing to bring comfort to the cancer patients who fear delays to drugs will mean delays to treatments and risks to their own health. And nothing in this Queen's speech will give the 3 million European citizens any comfort. Bina is with us today, a Dutch national who moved here in 1999. After the birth of her second daughter, she decided to become self-employed. But despite paying her taxes just as she should, the Home Office asked her for proof after proof before finally granting her settled status. Weeks of anxiety and uncertainty. Weeks of being treated like a second-class citizen in the place she calls home. Jennifer is also with us today. Her daughter, 38 years old, was born in Strasbourg, severely disabled. In 1986, Jennifer moved her family to the UK, where Marie could get better care and education. Marie has settled status now, but only because her mother was there to help, to make sure that her daughter's rights were protected. But there are so many other vulnerable EU citizens in our country who cannot rely on a family member or friend to help them through the complicated application process. And last but not least, Kristen, my constituent, has travelled down with her mother to be with us today too. Margaret moved to the UK 45 years ago from Norway. 2 years later, she married Jeff in Liverpool, and then Kristen was born. After raising her family, Margaret went back to work, paying her taxes every step of the way. As required, Margaret applied for settled status, but struggled to get her application approved. 45 years of contributing to our society, our economy, and the government treated her like a bureaucratic problem, causing unnecessary anxiety and fear to an elderly couple trying to enjoy their retirement years, their family fearful that they would be torn apart.
Will she give way?
I will give way to.
I thank her for giving way, and she very movingly describes the huge anxiety that a lot of EU citizens face by a very unfair and unsuitable application process. It should have been a registration process. This government just does not treat EU citizens fairly, and it has never counted the human costs of all that anxiety. Does she agree with me?
I wholeheartedly endorse what my honourable friend says about that human cost that has not been properly taken into account by this government. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank my right honourable friend. Would she also agree that this is a desperately anxious time for British citizens living elsewhere in the European Union who face not knowing whether they're going to be able to have health care 6 months from now and what is going to happen to their pensions? It's entirely intolerable and avoidable.
And again, my honourable friend is quite right. Very often in this place, we have these debates, we have the braying, we have the back and forth across the dispatch box, and it can feel like something of a pantomime of theatre. But this is people's lives that we're talking about. This is people sitting in the gallery today, and I was going to ask the Prime Minister, but he is no longer here. So I hope the ministers will have the courage to look Kristen, Margaret, Bina and Jennifer in the eye and apologise for the anxiety that they have caused to them and the 3 million other citizens from the EU 27. Our country is better than this. We don't turn our back on those who have come over to be our doctors, nurses, teachers and carers. We don't turn our back on our family, friends and loved ones. We don't turn our back on those who, like the rest of us, only want to make our country a better place. That's not who we are. There's little more British than getting all dressed up and taking part in pomp and ceremony. But there is a time and place for that. Today should not have been it. Today is a distraction from the fact that our country is fast hurtling towards catastrophe. That the Prime Minister is more interested in hanging on to power at any price than what is best for our country. This hardline Brexit government has no majority, no plan, no clue, and it is putting the future of our great country at risk. The benches opposite are clamouring for a general election, and we're ready to give them one. All they need to do is sign a simple letter and secure an extension to Article 50. I've said this before in the House, and I'll say it again. I relish the opportunity to take the Prime Minister on at the general election. And I cannot wait to take to the country the positive alternative vision that people deserve. A vision for a country where if you work hard and play by the rules, you are rewarded with a decent home and enough money to get by and live with dignity. Where every child and young person is nurtured and supported to become whatever they want to be, no matter who their parents are, how much money they have, or the colour of their skin. And where the most vulnerable among us can always get the help they need, with no judgment or sanction. Mr. Speaker, we know our country is better than what this government wants it to be. I know that we can be open, generous and collaborative. And I know our politics can be one of hope and inclusion, firmly set on the better future we want to create. But all this government wants to do is turn us into an insular, closed and selfish country, trading in fear and division to get their way. That's what this Queen's speech is all about, and that's why we Liberal Democrats will not be voting for it.
Thank you. Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
Speaker, I'm most grateful to have the opportunity of contributing relatively early in this Queen's speech debate. I draw the House's attention to my interests laid out in the Register of Members' Interests, and of course it's a great pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to follow the Right Honourable Lady for East Dunbartonshire, the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party. She and I worked together during the coalition government, a rather good government, Mr. Speaker, I hope you might agree. And I particularly want to echo the comments she made about Paddy Ashdown, whose memorial service a number of us attended in Westminster Abbey just a few weeks ago. I worked closely with him during the coalition. He was a tremendous force for good in the international development world, as well as being a great parliamentarian with a hugely distinguished career in politics behind him. And I can honestly say that in the international development firmament, we miss him very much indeed. So it was very good that the Right Honourable Lady chose to say what she did. I'd also like to congratulate the seconder and proposer of the Queen's speech today, a task which I undertook 27 years ago, although it feels like only yesterday, and I can still remember the fear and trepidation that attended me as I sat where my honourable friend is sitting, and announced that the speech was being seconded by an oily young man on the make. So you can tell, Mr. Speaker, that not much has changed in that respect. I am one of those, Mr. Speaker, who believe that the Queen's speech today encapsulates the most important principles of a one-nation approach in Britain today. And I am the secretary. I have the privilege of being the secretary of the One Nation group of Conservative parliamentarians, and I think that there is much in the speech, away from the sound and fury of politics in the run-up to the general election which is approaching. There is much in this speech which can be welcomed. My honourable friend who spoke just now set out a number of the key measures which ought to carry strong support across the whole of the House. And indeed, although with its wings spanned over the whole of British politics at the moment, are the momentous decisions that we will be making in the next few days on Europe. There is, of course, much that the Right Honourable Lady said about Europe, which is of concern to all of us. The point I would make to her is that in the speech she made today, in a way she was talking about a world before the referendum. Once the referendum had taken place and these arguments had been put to bed, in my view, we are all committed to implementing the referendum's result. I speak as someone who voted to remain and whose constituents declined to support that, but only just. And I do think that the sooner we are able to implement the result of that referendum, the better. I give way with pleasure.
Can I ask him why we haven't left on the 29th of March? Is it not because his bench has consistently not voted together on a particular Brexit proposal?
I think, with the greatest of respect, the Honourable Lady has something of a brass neck in intervening with that. On this side of the House, most of us, for most of the time, have voted in favour of a deal. It's the party opposite which has not voted in favour of a deal. So I respect the result of the referendum. I voted for the deal on the last two occasions when it became before the House, believing that at this point there was too little room for manoeuvre, and it was in the best interests of those I represent from the royal town of Sutton Coldfield to vote for it. So I cannot see any reason, really, not to support the deal which I expect my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, to put before the House shortly. And the message which I get, I will give away, a message which I get, Mr. Speaker, particularly outside of the M25 Beltway, is a message that people want this done. They want to move on, and they want next Saturday, when the House meets in extraordinary circumstances, for a deal to be secured and for us to move on to the next phase. Of course, it will only be moving on to the next phase, but psychologically, that will be very important for the markets. I give way.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Just to reinforce the point I made to the right honourable member for Ross Skye Harbour, as I pointed out, Mr. Speaker, to the Chamber, any form of Brexit is potentially so damaging to the interests of my constituents, and I must put my constituency first. That is why I cannot vote for any form of deal. I just want to make that plain and have that on the record. My constituents must come first.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I think that, to be fair across the House of Commons, nearly all of us are doing what we think is in the best interests of our constituents. And in my judgment, the best interests of my constituents is represented now by drawing a line and moving on. And as I say, of course, there are tremendously important negotiations to come. But once we have left the European Union, as we are bound to do following that referendum, in my judgment, we can start to repair two of the key things that are going to need so much to be repaired. The first are the deep, deep divisions which run throughout all our society, all our constituencies, throughout the four kingdoms of the United Kingdom, throughout all our constituencies. And I find the prospect of a second referendum, which is clearly going to be very much in contention in the next few days. I find the prospect a ghastly prospect, particularly in terms of putting back yet further the important and necessary act of healing these terrible divisions which disfigure our country. I give way.
Right,
wouldn't he accept that what people out there are saying is they want to get Brexit over? They don't want to get Brexit done, they want to get it over. And the simplest way to get it over is to put the actual deal, and now we can see Brexit as it really is, warts and all, to the people. So once and for all, they can decide, is this what they wanted? Is it more money, more control, more jobs? No, people don't want it. Let's get it over, let's have that vote, because it won't be getting it done. We'll have years and years of trade negotiation and poverty.
I don't agree with the honourable gentleman, and what I think he is arguing for is a second referendum, a confirmatory vote. I can't think of anything, Mr. Speaker, more likely to exacerbate and perpetuate these deep, deep divisions which disfigure our country than going on month after month for a second referendum. It is now for the House to decide whether or not we can secure a deal, and I very much hope the House will decide that on Saturday. Mr. Speaker, the second thing, and this bears upon the gracious speech today, the second thing which a resolution of Brexit at the weekend will allow is for Britain to once again re-engage internationally, where the House will be aware our reputation has plummeted over the last 3 years. We have been absent on parade and in a whole number of very serious big issues where Britain previously has shown great leadership: migration, climate change, protectionism, terrorism, dealing with the desperate threats that the Kurds face today, where Britain's voice needs to be heard trenchantly on these issues, and which Brexit has, over the last 3 years, prevented from happening. And I want just to take one particular area, which is climate change, where referred to in the Queen's speech. I've had the opportunity of talking to some of the people who have blockaded the streets around Westminster in the last week or so, Extinction Rebellion. It's very easy to mock these people, but actually I think there's something rather noble about the cause which they are espousing. Talking to some of them as I've negotiated my way through Trafalgar Square on my bicycle has been an interesting and constructive approach. But the problem is, it seems to me that the case they are putting is attacking the wrong target in attacking this government. Britain has been an intellectual leader in the major international forums at the UN and elsewhere in tackling climate change. I pay tribute particularly to the very important work done by Lord Turner and his colleagues on the committee. Britain has put its money where its mouth is in tackling climate change internationally as well as domestically. And, Mr. Speaker, starting with the coalition, when I had some responsibility for these matters, and we allocated for the International Climate Fund something like £7,000 million to 2016 to 2021, where for adaptation and mitigation of climate change we allocated from our hard-pressed taxpayers £5,800 million, and of course projected, as I think the Prime Minister said in his speech, between 2021 and 2026, £11.6 billion. And also, Mr. Speaker, we are streets ahead of some of our European friends and neighbours in developing the technology. I point to the Ayrton Fund, which has allocated £1 billion for innovative technology. Britain has set standards and an approach to climate change, both in adaptation and mitigation, which I submit has been enormously effective. And it is worth also, Mr. Speaker, bearing in mind that this year, for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, we will consume more energy from renewables and nuclear power than we will produced by coal and gas. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way and concur entirely with his aspiration for Britain to continue to lead internationally on key issues such as climate change. But does he not agree that Britain's role internationally will be diminished if it is no longer a member of the European Union? Britain has led a leading role within the European Union on these issues and internationally, partly because it has been a member of the European Union. And indeed, it will be very difficult for Britain to retain its status if it departs the European Union.
The argument the Honourable Lady puts is the argument which led me to vote to remain, because I didn't feel that the architecture of the European Union was enormously compelling, but I did think that most of the problems, some of which I listed are best handled by a more international approach. I think that is something where we are on the back foot. But nevertheless, I think it would be wrong not to conclude that even outside the European Union, working very closely with our allies and partners in NATO, in the United Nations, in Europe, in the Commonwealth, we can't still have an immense footprint in tackling these important issues. And I want just to mention, Mr. Speaker, one way under climate change funding we can do more of this. We've seen Britain leading in the vital, world-changing area of educating girls. This was certainly done in the Blair and Brown years. It was given a strong boost during the coalition years through the Girls' Education Challenge Fund, which was designed to get 1 million girls into school in areas where they have been denied any form of education. And of course we've had the current Prime Minister's staunch stand for both as Foreign Secretary and as Prime Minister in favour of that. And I want to see, as a result of the Queen's speech and of policy development, Britain doing much more to clean up the oceans of the planet. It's a very good use for the development budget. There are millions of very poor people who earn their living from the seas. Plastic has now reached almost the remotest places on Earth. It's been found 11 kilometres deep in the ocean. It's been found even on the island of St Helena, which is thousands of miles from the nearest landfall, and where, incidentally, the airport is proving to be such a success. And by 2050, there will be more plastic than fish in the oceans of our planet. Now, Mr. Speaker, the government's policy domestically has been very successful in terms of curtailing the use of plastic bags, microbeads, and as from April next year, we will ban plastic straws. And also the government's been very successful at using the market to achieve these desirable results wherever it can. But this is an area where British leadership could have a big impact, and I urge the government to put not only the money from the international development budget, or a proportion of it, but also the very considerable intellectual weight of British thinking and activity in the international fora behind that initiative. Mr. Speaker, the second point I wanted to make about the Queen's speech, and it's one that certainly complements a one-nation Queen's speech, and I hope a one-nation budget in due course, is to stand up for the case for capitalism and free markets, which is under great pressure, a point made earlier, not least from the Leader of the Opposition. We need to do more to stand up for them and explain why free enterprise has been such a powerful engine of advancement and social elevation, particularly for those who are amongst the least well off. And it has always been the case for governments to hedge around the free market system with rules, taxes and laws to stem excesses and excessive greed. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have recently watched the sad demise of Thomas Cook, now mercifully in the hands of Hayes, with the consequent loss of livelihoods and jobs and the inconvenience caused to hundreds of thousands of people getting back from their holiday. And I have to ask, Mr. Speaker, whether it is right in Britain today that the chief executive officer of that company has been paid £8.3 million since 2014, 2.9 million in a bonus in 2015. The two chief financial officers have been paid £7 million since 2014, and the non-executive directors £4 million, including the non-executive chairman at £1.6 million. Now, effectively, these are the directors of the UK's oldest travel agency, and they appear to have presided over the destruction of this business while awarding themselves collectively £47 million in pay and bonuses in the last 10 years. And I submit, Mr. Speaker, that brings the free enterprise system, the laws that this House should make, that brings us into disrepute. And I also want to make the point that 61 of the 100 the FTSE 100 companies, 61 of them, do not pay the living wage to their employees, something that was championed by the Prime Minister when he was Mayor of London very effectively, and also by the former Chancellor George Osborne. And yet, for those 61 companies, the average pay of the chief executive is just under £4 million per year. Now, the arguments for capitalism, free enterprise, are under attack, and we shall see that in the forthcoming general election. and they need to be explained, defended and propagated. And one of the ways we do that is by demonstrating fairness in the way the system works. Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude on another point, I hope, of one nation fairness, and it is to do with homelessness. Led by our Mayor in the West Midlands, Andy Street, we are doing our best to eradicate this problem. And last Friday, our Mayor was there at Aston Villa with 130 people sleeping out voluntarily to raise money to help tackle the curse of rough sleeping. And good progress is being made, Mr. Speaker, across the West Midlands in offering rough sleepers accommodation via Housing First. We've got 94 people into accommodation, far more, in fact, than the other 2 pilot areas have achieved. Housing First also provides the support individuals need, including drug and alcohol programmes and mental health support. And we all understand and know the complexities that are involved. So progress is being made. But this is not just about money. The government has been pretty generous, £100 million towards the rough sleeping strategy. In Sutton Coldfield, Mr. Speaker, we have 4 rough sleepers. At the moment, we have 2 extremely well-run food banks, which operate and help in a wider area than just the Royal Town, and 1 man who's been sleeping rough in our park for more than 20 years. Now, Mr. Speaker, the reason I mention this is I do not think any of us can sleep easy knowing about the extent of rough sleeping that is taking place in Britain and in our cities. In November 2018, the count of rough sleepers in Birmingham stood at 91. This is an increase from the previous year, and a very big increase indeed since 2010. And the number of new homeless is showing no signs of slowing. Mr. Speaker, I believe this is a complex and difficult problem, not just about finance and funding, but that I hope a good One Nation Queen's speech today, which I strongly support, will not neglect this very vulnerable cohort in our communities and will regard reversing this most unfortunate trend as a very high priority indeed.
Thank you. Mr. David Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure, if I may say so, to follow the Right Honourable Gentleman for Sutton Coldfield. I was in the chamber when he seconded the gracious speech 27 years ago. It was my first ever gracious speech, and I think it's a tribute to him that 27 years later he still finds himself quoted by those who ably proposed and seconded the gracious speech today. So congratulations on that longevity of his quotes from 1992, if I may, Mr. Speaker. This Queen's speech itself is dominated by Brexit, but it also has within it policy announcements on justice, on policing. It has some welcome measures that even I, as a Labour member, will welcome in due course on trophy hunting and on the restoration, potentially, of devolved government in Northern Ireland. But it also, in my view, Mr. Speaker, requires some additions, which I'll touch on briefly in a moment. And it does remind me that the Prime Minister appears to be running against his own government for the previous 10 years, with his emphasis on increasing policing, increasing investment in education, and increasing investment in health. And the proof of that pudding, Mr. Speaker, will be very much in the eating, because that is really a counterbalance to the austerity that the government has forced through, dare I say it, even with help from, in the first 5 years of this government, members from parties which now sit on the opposition benches. The Queen's speech, however, does dominate with Brexit as its first priority. The opening line of the gracious speech is that the government's priority has always been to secure the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union on the 31st of October. And you will know, Mr. Speaker, that the debates around the terms of that departure will be set potentially this week on the 17th and 18th of October at the European Council. Now, members opposite have said to members on this side of the House, we should vote for a deal. I confess, Mr. Speaker, that as of today, which is 5 days before we're expected to vote on a deal on Saturday of this week in the Saturday sitting, we have no clear idea of what that deal will be. We have no clear idea of what the terms of that deal could potentially be, what the boundaries of that deal would be, and what the impact of that deal would be on my constituents who make cars, who make planes, who make paper, who export sheep products, who provide tourism, and who require safety and security through policing and through support of international agreements on security. So I say to the opposition, to the government front bench, first and foremost, that I voted to trigger Article 50. I stood on a manifesto that said we would respect the referendum. But in that general election, which I didn't call, Mr. Speaker, which was called by the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Maidenhead, to get a mandate to force through whatever her form of Brexit was, I made commitments in that 2017 general election for things which I still don't know whether or not they're in the agreement on Saturday forthcoming. So I stood on a manifesto, Madam Deputy Speaker, which was against no deal, and I voted against that. I stood on a manifesto which, in my terms in Wales, was for a customs union and for a single market. And I don't yet know what the outcome of those discussions are. So I can't say whether I would ever vote for a deal on Saturday of this week, because we don't know what it would be. But I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that my question is really, is it going to be better? Because the ministers in the gracious speech today said they're going to implement new regimes for fisheries, for agriculture, for trade, and for opportunities arising from the European Union once we've left. Now, again, I don't know, Madam Deputy Speaker, what those opportunities are going to be. But I've seen some adverts on the television this week that tell me that I've now got to, on the November the 1st, if we go ahead with any form of deal or no deal the government are proposing, that I'll have to check whether my healthcare is still valid in Europe. I'll have to check whether I can send and how I can send goods to Europe from businesses in my constituency. I'll have to check my insurance on travel because it won't be valid in the great new world that we face. And I'll have to check whether I can drive in the European Union after November the 1st. Now, all of these things, I still don't know, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether or not we have a positive or a negative at the end of this week. None of this was on the bus when it came driving through the United Kingdom on the 23rd of June 2016. We still have no details in the document that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster produced last week on what's going to happen to the European arrest warrant, what's going to happen to European policing cooperation, what's going to happen to SIS2, where we exchange information about paedophiles, criminal gangs, drug abusers. Now, I have to say to the ministers who are sitting there and who will participate in this part of the debate, as a former police minister, as a former justice minister, I can't vote for anything when I don't know yet whether we have police cooperation, international cooperation on drug trafficking prevention, international cooperation on child pornography and child abuse prevention. I don't know those things yet. So I hope during the course of this debate we can get some clarity on what we're being asked to vote for potentially on Saturday of this week. It strikes me as well, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the farmers in my constituency who currently export sheep to Europe don't know yet whether they're going to face a 40% tariff. The vehicle manufacturers at Toyota and Vauxhalls at Ellesmere Port, employing thousands of people in my constituency, don't yet know what the tariff regime will be, in what form it will take. The aircraft manufacturers at Airbus don't yet know what those things will be. So I think there's a real sense of urgency on the government's part to try to pull together what we are voting on, what we potentially have in front of us. Because I've voted already for some forms of deals that the government have brought forward. I've voted against some form of deals that the government have brought forward. But we have no clarity on what that deal would be. And it strikes me that the only way we're going to bring this together ultimately now is to have a settlement on a deal, whatever that deal might be. And I think now to put that back to the people so that people can decide whether that confirmatory vote is needed to support whatever that deal comes before the people in this Parliament. So I will, as I have done in the past, support that confirmatory vote in due course. And I hope we can find a mechanism to find a way to bring a deal back where people can see what Brexit means, because even now, 4 days from a vote, we don't yet know what that means in practice. But the Queen's speech, gracious speech, Madam Deputy Speaker, is not all about Brexit. There are some measures in the Queen's speech, gracious speech, about the question of violent offenders. I suppose the question for me is what's happened to the excellent work that was being done by the Justice Secretary, the member for Hertfordshire South West, when he was talking about movement on 6-month sentences and trying to abolish 6-month sentences for people who were struggling and being imprisoned for under 6 months. There are many people now who need to have some clarity, I think, about how the government is approaching the question of sentencing, because we seem to have in the Queen's speech sentence inflation for serious offences, which we can debate and discuss in due course, but we have no statement about what's going to happen to people who are being imprisoned on a regular basis for under 6 months, where there's no opportunity to intervene in their behaviour, where there's no opportunity to turn their lives around, and where we do not have the potential to make an impact through the prison system. I'd like to look at in more detail, but probably welcome, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Police Covenant proposal that is in the gracious speech. I met with the Police Federation at my party conference in Brighton this year. They're very keen on the Police Covenant. I think we want to see that happening. I think I can give the ministers cross-party support on that. And I think we can also give them cross-party support on replacing numbers of police officers. I think the key test of that pledge is whether or not and how those police officers are going to be recruited, over what period, and how many we're losing and how many we need to recruit to replace the 21,000 that have been removed by this government since I was the police minister 10 years ago, this very month and period in time now. We had lower levels of crime, lower levels of violent crime, more police officers, more security and more resolution of community issues than we've got now, because over that 10-year period, violent crime has risen, crime has been more damaging, and I think that the sudden realisation that those police are needed is something which is welcome, but which we need to see how it's going to be delivered. And I also, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to welcome Helen's Law, which means that people will not leave prison until they give the notification of where a body that has been murdered resides. I think that's fair and proper to do that. And I pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for St Helens North, in driving that forward. I want to, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, welcome the issue on trophy hunting. Again, we want to look at the detail of the bill, but I think it is appalling that people can go on holiday to shoot tigers, leopards, lions, giraffes, and a whole range of other animals with no impunity. It's appalling to have trophy hunting, and the import being stopped of materials to this country is very much welcome. The detail we want to look at, and again I will want to look at how UK citizens who are taking part in trophy hunting are restricted, not just the bringing back of trophy hunted animal parts to the United Kingdom. I welcome the potential restoration of devolved government in Northern Ireland. That's key as well to the whole settlement of the Brexit issue. One thing did strike me in the immigration bill, which I think we need to return to in due course, is that there's a statement in the helpful explanatory notes that says that we're going to clarify the immigration status of Irish citizens once free movement migration framework is repealed. This means Irish citizens will generally not be required to leave or enter or remain, require leave to enter or remain in the United Kingdom. My question, Madam Deputy Speaker, is what the word generally means. Because the Good Friday Agreement and the work I did as a Northern Ireland Minister meant that people can identify as British or Irish, feel comfortable in that, and can move around the United Kingdom and Ireland based on their identification. The word generally strikes a worry in me as to what that actually means in practice. I welcome the potential of some of the issues in the National Infrastructure Plan. We have a North Wales growth deal. I know the Minister will know that from when he briefly but successfully navigated the role of the Wales office, which he did until moved to his new position. I'm sure he misses the Wales office tremendously, but he will be able to, I hope, secure the North Wales growth deal as part of this National Infrastructure Plan as a matter of some urgency. I just want to finish, Madam Deputy Speaker, on two particular issues I want to see included in the gracious speech. The first is, as part of the violent crime reduction bill that will be forthcoming, the ministers and the House will know that there is severe concern about attacks on shop workers in their place of work. There are currently around 115 shop workers per day attacked in the course of preventing shoplifting upholding legislation on alcohol, tobacco, solvent sales, and now on knives and acid sales. Those shop workers are upholding the laws that we have passed in this House, and yet they have limited protection in this House accordingly. Now, I'm pleased that my honourable friend from Harrow is here, because as a member of the Cooperative Party, I know the Cooperative Party has pushed very hard for action on support for shop staff. I know my own trade union, Usdaw, has pushed very hard. We have secured from the government a consultation which is currently has been ongoing, which is closed, and which the member for Louth and Horncastle, when Minister in the Home Office, she's now moved, but when Minister in the Home Office for responsibility for a tax on shop staff, undertook to report back on the consultation by the end of November. I hope that the current Police Minister will do so. I hope that there will be outcomes from that which will give protections to shop staff in their daily lives, and I hope that at the time the Violent Crime Bill is brought before the House, that there will be an opportunity for action to be taken on protecting shop staff by giving greater support to measures which will discourage violence against shop staff and ensure that staff live freedom from fear about their daily workplace. It's very important that we do that, and there's certainly cross-party support in this House, but also support from the British Retail Consortium, National Federation of Retail Newsagents, Usdaw, Co-op Group, small supermarkets and stores right across the board. Nobody, apart from the current government, have resisted the potential for action on this. They've undertaken the consultation, and I hope that consultation will prove fruitful. But I want to see it back before Christmas, as promised. And that would be there. And the final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wanted to make is just on another question, which is on air weapon safety. Now, there's a range of views on air weapon safety in the House, and I know that. But the government itself launched a review in December 2017 on the use and control of air weapons. I have an interest in that because constituents of mine have been killed accidentally by the use of air weapons, where a lockable cabinet or a safety lock would have made a real difference to the safety of that air weapon. That is one of the facets of the consultation. The consultation commenced on the 12th of December 2017. It closed on the 6th of February 2018. It is now October the 14th, 2019, and the Home Office has still not responded to the consultation on air weapon safety. Now again, my plea to the ministers is there's an opportunity for that consultation to be concluded. I don't mind whatever the ministers want to say on that, but there's an opportunity to conclude the consultation because constituents of mine have invested time and energy in putting points to the consultation, which is about the loss of their loved ones, to find that no response has come back from that consultation to date. So I want the government to produce the consultation response for that airgun consultation, and if there are measures, which I hope there would be, across party on producing better airgun safety, such as lockable cabinets by law, that could be done in the Violent Crime Bill. It could be done as part of the Home Office Christmas tree bill that we know will be there in any session that goes ahead, subject to any general election that occurs. So my plea, Madam Deputy Speaker, is for clarity on the outcome of the consultation so that we can look at this bill forming part of this, the outcome of that consultation forming part of legislation in due course. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, give us some idea what's happening on Saturday, number one. Give us some idea about what's happening to the consultations on shop staff attacks and on air guns. And let us work together on areas where we do have cooperation, on trophy hunting, on infrastructure plans. And let us fight at some point the battle about the wider political discussions that the Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield has had about capitalism versus government intervention in an active, positive society. Because I actually believe, finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, government intervention and government is a force for good. It's what given me the health service and health in life. It's what's given me education in life. It's what's given my family the security of housing in life. It's what's given opportunities to thousands of millions of people across this country. And an active government that takes a role in the future is what I seek with the future Labour government whenever this election comes.
Speech Bottomley.
Deputy Speaker, not the leader of the
Liberal Democrat Party talked about Paddy Ashdown, our former colleague. He was one of the people who, in part, worked for my father in Geneva in the 1970s. And I think that he is an example of those who, when they say people who come into Parliament can't do anything else, are wrong. And there are many people who did many things before they came into Parliament, whether domestic responsibilities or professional or voluntary. And there are many who, when they leave, do the same thing again. So I think that we ought to look on this place and our debates as a way of recruiting